Welcome to Read Realm, where we upload different types of audiobooks every week. Before starting to listen to this book, please subscribe to our channel to support this channel and give the chance to upload more books for bookworms. Welcome to part 2 of Never Split the Difference by former FBI negotiator Chris Voss. In this section, we dive even deeper into Voss's powerful negotiation tactics that can be applied in any high-stakes conversation. Get ready to uncover advanced techniques and psychological insights that will change how you approach negotiation, helping you secure the best outcomes confidently. Chapter 5. Trigger the 2 words that immediately transform any negotiation. In August 2000, the militant Islamic group Abu Sayyaf, in the southern Philippines, broadcast that it had captured a CIA agent. The truth was not as newsworthy, or as valuable to the rebels. Abu Sayyaf had kidnapped Jeffrey Schilling, a 24-year-old American who had traveled near their base in Holo Island. A California native, Schilling became a hostage with a $10 million price tag on his head. At the time I was a supervisory special agent, SSA, attached to the FBI's Elite Crisis Negotiation Unit, CNU. The CNU is the equivalent of the Special Forces of Negotiations. It's attached to the FBI's Hostage Rescue Team, HRT. Both are national counterterrorist response assets. They are the best of the best. The CNU is based at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. The FBI Academy has come to be known by the one word, Quantico. Rightly or wrongly, Quantico has developed the reputation as one of the centers, if not the center of knowledge, for law enforcement. When a negotiation is going badly and the negotiators involved are directed to call and find out what Quantico has to say, the CNU is who they call. CNU developed what is a powerful staple in the high-stakes world of crisis negotiation, the Behavioral Change Stairway Model, BCSM. The model proposes 5 stages: active listening, empathy, rapport, influence, and behavioral change, that take any negotiator from listening to influencing behavior. The origins of the model can be traced back to the great American psychologist Tahl Raz, who proposed that real change can only come when a therapist accepts the client as he or she is, an approach known as unconditional positive regard. The vast majority of us, however, as Rogers explained, come to expect that love, praise, and approval are dependent on saying and doing the things people, initially, our parents, consider correct. That is, because for most of us the positive regard we experience is conditional, we develop a habit of hiding who we really are and what we really think, instead calibrating our words to gain approval but disclosing little. Which is why so few social interactions lead to actual behavior change. Consider the typical patient with severe coronary heart disease recovering from open heart surgery. The doctor tells the patient, "This surgery isn't a cure. The only way to truly prolong your life is to make the following behavior changes." The grateful patient responds, "Yes, yes, yes, of course, doctor. This is my second chance. I will change." And do they? Study after study has shown that, no, nothing changes. 2 years after their operation, more than 90% of patients haven't changed their lifestyle at all. Though the stakes of an everyday negotiation with your child, boss, or client are usually not as high as that of a hostage or health crisis negotiation, the psychological environment necessary for not just temporary in-the-moment compliance, but real gut-level change, is the same. If you successfully take someone up the behavioral change stairway, each stage attempting to engender more trust and more connection, there will be a breakthrough moment when unconditional positive regard is established and you can begin exerting influence. After years of refining the BCSM and its tactics, I can teach anyone how to get to that moment. But as cardiologists know all too well, and legions of B-school grads weaned on the most famous negotiating book in the world, Getting to Yes, have ultimately discovered, you more than likely haven't gotten there yet if what you're hearing is the word yes. As you'll soon learn, the sweetest two words in any negotiation are actually, "That's right." Create a subtle epiphany. I was a natural for the shilling case. I had spent some time in the Philippines and had an extensive background in terrorism from my New York City days assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTF. A few days after Schilling became a hostage, my partner Chuck Reggiani and I flew to Manila to run the negotiations. Along with Jim Nixon, the FBI's highest official in Manila, we conferred with top Philippine military brass. They agreed to let us guide the negotiations. Then we got down to business. One of us would take charge of the negotiation strategy for the FBI and consequently for the US government. That became my role. With the support of my colleagues, my job was to come up with the strategy, get it approved, and implement it. As a result of the Schilling case, would become the FBI's lead international kidnapping negotiator. Our principal adversary was Abu Sabaya, the rebel leader who personally negotiated for Schilling's ransom. Sabaya was a veteran of the rebel movement with a violent past. He was straight out of the movies, a terrorist sociopath killer. He had a history of rape, murder, and beheadings. He liked to record his bloody deeds on video and send them to the Philippine media. Sabaya always wore sunglasses, a bandana, a black t-shirt, and camo pants. He thought it made him a more dashing figure. If you look for any photos of Abu Sayyaf terrorists from this period, you always see one in sunglasses. That's Sabaya. Sabaya loved the media. He had the Philippine reporters on speed dial. They'd call him and ask him questions in Tagalog, his native tongue. He would answer in English because he wanted the world to hear his voice on CNN. They should make a movie about me, he would tell reporters. In my eyes, Sabaya was a cold-blooded businessman with an ego as big as Texas. A real shark. Sabaya knew he was in the commodities game. In Jeffrey Schilling, he had an item of value. How much could he get for it? He would find out, and I intended it to be a surprise he wouldn't like. As an FBI agent, I wanted to free the hostage and bring the criminal to justice. One crucial aspect of any negotiation is to figure out how your adversary arrived at his position. Sabaya threw out the $10 million ransom based on a business calculation. First, the United States was offering $5 million for information leading to the arrest of any of the remaining fugitives from the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Sabaya reasoned that if the United States would pay $5 million to get its hands on someone it didn't like, it would pay much more for a citizen. Second, a rival faction of the Abu Sayyaf had just reportedly been paid $20 million for 6 Western European captives. Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi had made the payment as development aid. This absurdity had been compounded by a significant portion of the ransom being paid in counterfeit bills. It was an opportunity for Gaddafi to both embarrass Western governments and get money over the table to groups with whom he sympathized. I'm sure he laughed about that episode until the day he died. Regardless, a price had been set. Sabaya did the math and figured Schilling was worth $10 million. Problem was, Jeff Schilling came from a working-class family. His mother could come up with $10,000, perhaps. The United States wasn't about to pay $1. But we would allow a payment to be made if it could be run as a sting operation. If we could draw Sabaya into an offer-counteroffer bargaining situation, we had a bargaining system that worked every time. We could beat him down to where we wanted him, get the hostage out, and set up the sting. For months Sabaya refused to budge. He argued that Muslims in the Philippines had suffered 500 years of oppression, since Spanish missionaries had brought Catholicism to the Philippines in the 16th century. He recited instances where atrocities had been committed against his Islamic forebears. He explained why the Abu Sayyaf wanted to establish an Islamic state in the southern Philippines. Fishing rights had been violated. You name it, he thought it up and used it. Sabaya wanted $10 million in war damages, not ransom, but war damages. He held firm in his demand and kept us out of the offer-counteroffer system we wanted to use against him. And he occasionally dropped in threats that he was torturing Jeff Schilling. Sabaya negotiated directly with Benji, a Filipino military officer. They talked in Tagalog. We reviewed transcripts translated to English and used them to advise Benji. I rotated in and out of Manila and oversaw the talks and strategy. I instructed Benji to ask what Schilling had to do with 500 years of bad blood between Muslims and Filipinos. He told Sabaya that $10 million was not possible. No matter what approach we took to reason with Sabaya over why Schilling had nothing to do with the war damages, it fell on deaf ears. Our first, that's right, the breakthrough actually came when I was negotiating with Benji. He was a true Filipino patriot and hero. He was the leader of the Philippine National Police's Special Action Force and had been in his share of firefights. On many occasions, Benji and his men had been sent on rescue missions to save hostages, and they had a sterling record. His men were feared, for good reason. They rarely took handcuffs. Benji wanted to take a hard line with Sabaya and speak to him in direct, no-nonsense terms. We wanted to engage Sabaya in dialogue to discover what made the adversary tick. We actually wanted to establish rapport with an adversary. To Benji that was distasteful. Benji told us he needed a break. We had been working him nearly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for several weeks. He wanted to spend some time with his family in the mountains north of Manila. We agreed, but only on the condition that we could accompany him and spend several hours both on Saturday and Sunday working on negotiation strategy. That Saturday night we sat in the library of the American ambassador's summer residence working on the strategy. As I was explaining to Benji the value of establishing a rapport-based, working relationship, even with an adversary as dangerous as Sabaya, I could see a snarl coming over his face. I realized I needed to negotiate with Benji. "You hate Sabaya, don't you?" I said, leading with a label. Benji unloaded on me. "I tell you I do," he said. "He has murdered and raped. He has come up on our radio when we were lobbing mortars on his position and said, 'These mortars are music to my ears.' I heard his voice come on our radio one day and celebrate that he was standing over the body of one of my men. This outburst was Benji's equivalent of, 'That's right.' As he acknowledged his rage, I watched him get control of his anger and calm down. Though he had been very good up to that point, from that moment forward Benji became a superstar. He blossomed into a truly talented negotiator. This negotiation between Benji and me was no different than any other negotiation between colleagues who disagree on a strategy. Before you convince them to see what you're trying to accomplish, you have to say the things to them that will get them to say, 'That's right.' The 'that's right' breakthrough usually doesn't come at the beginning of a negotiation. It's invisible to the counterpart when it occurs, and they embrace what you've said. To them, it's a subtle epiphany. Trigger a 'that's right' with a summary. After 4 months of negotiations, Sabaya still refused to budge. I decided it was time to hit the reset switch. Benji had gotten so good at extending the conversations that you could tell that there were times that Sabaya must have paced back and forth for an hour before calling Benji, trying to figure out how to get what he wanted. He would call in and say, "Tell me yes or no. Just yes or no." We had to get Sabaya off this war damages nonsense. No matter what type of questioning, logic, or reasoning we tried with him, he wouldn't release it. Threats against Schilling came and went. We talked him down each time. I decided that in order to break through this phase we needed to reposition Sabaya with his own words in a way that would dissolve barriers. We needed to get him to say, "That's right." At the time, I didn't know for sure what kind of breakthrough it was going to give us. I just knew we needed to trust the process. I wrote a 2-page document that instructed Benji to change course. We were going to use nearly every tactic in the active listening arsenal. 1. Effective pauses. Silence is powerful. We told Benji to use it for emphasis, to encourage Sabaya to keep talking until eventually, like clearing out a swamp, the emotions were drained from the dialogue. 2. Minimal encouragers. Besides silence, we instructed using simple phrases, such as, yes, okay, or I see, to effectively convey that Benji was now paying full attention to Sabaya and all he had to say. 3. Mirroring. Rather than argue with Sabaya and try to separate Schilling from the war damages, Benji would listen and repeat back what Sabaya said. 4. Labeling. Benji should give Sabaya's feelings a name and identify with how he felt. It all seems so tragically unfair. I can now see why you sound so angry. 5. Paraphrase. Benji should repeat what Sabaya is saying back to him in Benji's own words. This, we told him, would powerfully show him you really do understand and aren't merely parroting his concerns. 6. Summarize. A good summary is the combination of re-articulating the meaning of what is said plus the acknowledgement of the emotions underlying that meaning. Paraphrasing plus labeling equals summary. We told Benji he needed to listen and repeat the world according to Abu Sabaya. He needed to fully and completely summarize all the nonsense that Sabaya had come up with about war damages and fishing rights and 500 years of oppression. And once he did that fully and completely, the only possible response for Sabaya, and anyone faced with a good summary, would be, that's right. 2 days later Sabaya phoned Benji. Sabaya spoke. Benji listened. When he spoke, he followed my script. He commiserated with the rebel group's predicament. Mirroring, encouraging, labeling, each tactic worked seamlessly and cumulatively to soften Sabaya up and begin shifting his perspective. Finally, Benji repeated in his own words Sabaya's version of history and the emotions that came with that version. Sabaya was silent for nearly a minute. Finally he spoke. That's right, he said. We ended the call. The war damages demand just disappeared. From that point forward Sabaya never mentioned money again. He never asked for another dime for the release of Jeffrey Schilling. He ultimately became so weary of this case and holding the young Californian that he let down his guard. Schilling escaped from their camp, and Philippine commandos swooped in and rescued him. He returned safely to his family in California. 2 weeks after Jeff Schilling escaped, Sabaya called Benji. Have you been promoted yet? He asked. If not, you should have been. Why? Benji asked. I was going to hurt Jeffrey, Sabaya said. I don't know what you did to keep me from doing that, but whatever it was, it worked. In June 2002 Sabaya was killed in a shootout with Philippine military units. In the heat of negotiations for a man's life, I didn't appreciate the value of those 2 words, that's right. But when I studied the transcripts and reconstructed the trajectory of the negotiations, I realized that Sabaya had changed course when he uttered those words. Benji had used some fundamental techniques that we had developed over many years. He had reflected Sabaya's vision. He had stepped back from confrontation. He had allowed Sabaya to speak freely and exhaust his version of events. That's right, signaled that negotiations could proceed from deadlock. It broke down a barrier that was impeding progress. It created a realization point with our adversary where he actually agreed on a point without the feeling of having given in. It was a stealth victory. When your adversaries say, that's right, they feel they have assessed what you've said and pronounced it as correct of their own free will. They embrace it. That's right, allowed us to draw out the talks and divert Sabaya from hurting Schilling. And it gave Philippine commandos time to mount their rescue operation. In hostage negotiations, we never tried to get to yes as an endpoint. We knew that, yes, is nothing without how. And when we applied hostage negotiating tactics to business, we saw how, that's right, often leads to the best outcomes. That's right is great, but if you're right, nothing changes. Driving toward that's right is a winning strategy in all negotiations. But hearing you're right is a disaster. Take my son, Brandon, and his development as a football player. He had been playing on the offensive and defensive lines all through high school. At 6'2" and 250 pounds, he was formidable. He loved to knock every player wearing an opposing jersey to the ground. Having played quarterback, I didn't fully appreciate the blue-collar nature of being a lineman. Linemen are like mountain goats. They put their heads down and hit things. It makes them happy. At St. Thomas More Prep School in Connecticut, Brandon's coach moved him to linebacker, and his role suddenly changed from hitting everything he saw to avoiding players who were trying to block him. He was supposed to play off blocks, dodge them, if you will, and get to the ball. But Brandon continued to confront opposing blockers head-on, which kept him from getting to the ball carrier. His coach pleaded with him to avoid blockers, but Brandon couldn't change. He loved to hit. Flattening opposing players was a source of pride. Both his coach and I kept trying to explain it to him. And every time we got the worst possible answer, you're right. He agreed, in theory, but he didn't own the conclusion. Then he would go right back to the behavior we were trying to get him to stop. He would smash blockers and take himself out of the play. Why is "you're right" the worst answer? Consider this: whenever someone is bothering you, and they just won't let up, and they won't listen to anything you have to say, what do you tell them to get them to shut up and go away? You're right. It works every time. Tell people you're right, and they get a happy smile on their face and leave you alone for at least 24 hours. But you haven't agreed to their position. You have used "you're right" to get them to quit bothering you. I was in the same situation with Brandon. He didn't hear me and embrace my request. What could I say to get through to this kid? How could I reach Brandon and help him change course? I thought back to Benji and Sabaya. I took Brandon aside before a crucial game. I had searched my mind for a way to hear the two critical words, "that's right." "You seem to think it's unmanly to dodge a block," I told him. "You think it's cowardly to get out of someone's way that's trying to hit you." Brandon stared at me and paused. "That's right," he said. With those words, Brandon embraced the reality of what was holding him back. Once he understood why he was trying to knock down every blocker, he changed course. He started avoiding the blocks and became an exceptionally fine linebacker. With Brandon on the field tackling and playing star linebacker, St. Thomas More School won every game. Using "that's right" to make the sale. Getting to "that's right" helped one of my students in her job as a sales representative for a large pharmaceutical company. She was trying to sell a new product to a doctor who used similar medication. He was the largest user of this kind of medication in her territory. The sale was critical to her success. In her first appointments, the doctor dismissed her product. He said it was no better than the ones he was already using. He was unfriendly. He didn't even want to hear her viewpoint. When she presented the positive attributes of her product, he interrupted her and knocked them down. Making the sales pitch, she soaked up as much as possible about the doctor. She learned that he was passionate about treating his patients. Each patient was special in his eyes. Improving their sense of calm and peace was the most important outcome for him. How could she put her understanding of his needs, desires, and passions to work for her? At her next visit, the doctor asked what medications she wanted to discuss. Rather than tout the benefits of her product, she talked about him and his practice. "Doctor," she said, "the last time I was in we spoke about your patients with this condition. I remember thinking that you seemed very passionate about treating them, and how you worked hard to tailor the specific treatment to each and every patient. He looked her in the eyes as if he were seeing her for the first time. That's right, he said. I really feel like I'm treating an epidemic that other doctors are not picking up on, which means that a lot of patients are not getting treated adequately. She told him he seemed to have a deep understanding of how to treat these patients, especially because some of them didn't respond to the usual medications. They talked about specific challenges he had confronted in treating his patients. He gave her examples. When he was finished, she summarized what he had said, especially the intricacies and problems in treatment. You seem to tailor specific treatments and medications for each patient, she said. That's right, he responded. This was the breakthrough she had hoped to reach. The doctor had been skeptical and cold. But when she recognized his passion for his patients, using a summary, the walls came down. He dropped his guard, and she was able to gain his trust. Rather than pitch her product, she let him describe his treatment and procedures. With this, she learned how her medication would fit into his practice. She then paraphrased what he said about the challenges of his practice and reflected them back to him. Once the doctor signaled his trust and rapport, she could tout the attributes of her product and describe precisely how it would help him reach the outcomes he desired for his patients. He listened intently. It might be perfect for treating a patient who has not benefited from the medication I have been prescribing, he told her. Let me give yours a try. She made the sale. Using That's Right for career success. One of my Korean students got to That's Right in negotiating with his ex-boss for a new job. Returning to Seoul after getting his MBA, he wanted to work in his company's consumer electronics division, rather than the semiconductor section, where he had been stationed. He was a human resources specialist. Under the company's rules, he believed he had to remain in his previous department, unless he could also get approval from his ex-boss. He had gotten 2 job offers from the consumer products division. He phoned his ex-boss from the United States. You should reject this offer and find your spot here with the semiconductor division, the ex-boss said. My student hung up depressed. If he wanted to advance in the company, he had to obey his former superior. He rejected the 2 offers and prepared to return to the semiconductor side. Then he contacted a friend who was a senior manager in the human resources department to check on the company's regulations. He found there was no rule that he had to stay within his division, but he did need his ex-boss's blessing to switch. He phoned his ex-boss again. This time he asked questions to draw him out. Is there any reason you want me to go to the semiconductor headquarters? He asked. It's the best position for you, the ex-boss said. The best position? He asked. It sounds like there's no regulation that I have to remain with the semiconductor division, he said. The ex-boss said. I don't think there is any. Then will you please tell me what made you decide that I remain in the semiconductor headquarters? He asked. The ex-boss said he needed someone to help him network at headquarters between the semiconductor and consumer products divisions. So it sounds like you could approve my new position no matter which division, as long as I was in headquarters and could help you communicate better with the top managers. That's right, he said. I must admit I need your help in headquarters. My student realized he had made a breakthrough. Not only had his ex-boss uttered those sweet words, that's right, but he had revealed his true motive. He needed an ally in headquarters. Is there any other help you need? He asked. Let me tell you everything, the ex-boss responded. It turns out his former superior would be up for a promotion to vice president in 2 years. He desperately wanted to move up into this job. He needed someone in headquarters to lobby the company's CEO. I would help you in any way, my student said. But I could help with the networking and also talk you up to the CEO even if I were at headquarters with the consumer products division, right? That's right, he said. If you get an offer from the consumer products unit, I will approve it. Bingo! By asking questions that got him to, "That's right," my student had achieved his goal. He also got his boss to reveal two black swans, the unspoken, underlying breakthrough dynamics of a negotiation, explored and more. Detail in Chapter 10. His boss needed someone to help him network and communicate in headquarters. His boss would be up for a promotion and needed someone to talk him up to the CEO. My student was able to win the job he desired on the consumer electronics division. And he's been talking up his former boss. I was stunned, he wrote me in an email. In this culture, it is not really possible to know what a superior is thinking. I have many opportunities to travel the country and speak to business leaders, either in formal speaking engagements or private counseling sessions. I entertain them with war stories, then I describe some basic negotiating skills. I always impart a few techniques. Getting to "that's right" is a staple. After a speech in Los Angeles, one of the attendees, Emily, sent me an email. "Hi Chris, I feel compelled to tell you that I just tried the "that's right" technique in a price negotiation with a potential new client. And I got what I wanted. I'm so excited. Before I probably would have just gone with the in the middle suggested price, halfway between my initial offer and her initial counter. Instead, I believe I correctly assessed her motivations, presented her with the right statement to get to a "that's right" in her mind, and then she proposed the solution I wanted and asked if I would agree to it. So, I did, of course. Thank you, Emily. And I thought to myself, that's right. Key lessons. Sleeping in the same bed and dreaming different dreams is an old Chinese expression that describes the intimacy of partnership, whether in marriage or in business, without the communication necessary to sustain it. Such is the recipe for bad marriages and bad negotiations. With each party having its own set of objectives, its own goals and motivations, the truth is that the conversational niceties, the socially lubricating "yes" and "you're rights" that get thrown out fast and furious early in any interaction, are not in any way a substitute for real understanding between you and your partner. The power of getting to that understanding, and not to some simple "yes," is revelatory in the art of negotiation. The moment you've convinced someone that you truly understand her dreams and feelings, the whole world that she inhabits, mental and behavioral change becomes possible, and the foundation for a breakthrough has been laid. Use these lessons to lay that foundation. Creating unconditional positive regard opens the door to changing thoughts and behaviors. Humans have an innate urge towards socially constructive behavior. The more a person feels understood, and positively affirmed in that understanding, the more likely that urge for constructive behavior will take hold. "That's right" is better than "yes." Strive for it. Reaching "that's right" in a negotiation creates breakthroughs. Use a summary to trigger a "that's right." The building blocks of a good summary are a label combined with paraphrasing. Identify, re-articulate, and emotionally affirm the world according to. Chapter 6. Bend their reality. One Monday morning in Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, a call came in to the FBI office from the nephew of a prominent Haitian political figure. He spoke so fast he had to repeat his story 3 times before I understood. But finally I got the basics. Kidnappers had snatched his aunt from her car, and their ransom demand was $150,000. "Give us the money," the kidnappers told him, "or your aunt is going to die." In the lawless, chaotic wake of the 2004 rebellion that toppled President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, Haiti surpassed Colombia as the kidnap capital of the Americas. In fact, with between 8 and 10 people abducted every day in the Caribbean nation of 8 million, Haiti earned the dubious honor of having the highest kidnapping rate in the world. During this onslaught of abductions and death threats, I was the FBI's lead international kidnapping negotiator. And I had never seen anything like it. Reports of abductions, increasingly bold, daylight attacks right in Port-au-Prince, seem to roll into the office hourly. 14 students abducted on their school bus. American missionary Philip Snyder shot in an ambush and seized along with a Haitian boy he was taking to Michigan for eye surgery. Prominent Haitian politicians and businessmen bundled from their homes in broad daylight. No one was spared. Most of the abductions went down the same way. Skeeth mask-clad kidnappers surrounded a house or a car, forced entry with a gun, and snatched a vulnerable victim, usually a woman, child, or elderly person. Early on, there was the possibility that the kidnappings were driven by politically aligned gangs seeking to destabilize Haiti's new government. This proved to be wrong. Haitian criminals are famous for employing brutal means for political ends, but when it came to kidnappings, it was almost always all business. Later on, I'll get to how we pieced together the clues to discover who the perpetrators were and what they really wanted, invaluable information when it came to negotiating with and destabilizing these gangs. But first I want to discuss the crystallizing feature of high-stakes, life and death negotiating, that is, how little of it is on the surface. When that Monday ransom call came in to the politician's nephew, the guy was so petrified he could only think of doing one thing: paying the thugs. His reaction makes sense. When you get a call from brutal criminals who say they'll kill your aunt unless you pay them immediately, it seems impossible to find leverage in the situation. So you pay the ransom and they release your relative, right? Wrong. There's always leverage. Negotiation is never a linear formula: add X to Y to get Z. We all have irrational blind spots, hidden needs, and undeveloped notions. Once you understand that subterranean world of unspoken needs and thoughts, you'll discover a universe of variables that can be leveraged to change your counterpart's needs and expectations. From using some people's fear of deadlines and the mysterious power of odd numbers, to our misunderstood relationship to fairness, there are always ways to bend our counterpart's reality so it conforms to what we ultimately want to give them, not to what they initially think they deserve. Don't compromise. Let's go back to the $150,000 ransom demand. We're always taught to look for the win-win solution, to accommodate, to be reasonable. So what's the win-win here? What's the compromise? The traditional negotiating logic that's drilled into us from an early age, the kind that exalts compromises, says, let's just split the difference and offer them $75,000. Then everyone's happy. No. Just, simply, no. The win-win mindset pushed by so many negotiation experts is usually ineffective and often disastrous. At best, it satisfies neither side. And if you employ it with a counterpart who has a win-lose approach, you're setting yourself up to be swindled. Of course, as we've noted previously, you need to keep the cooperative, rapport-building, empathetic approach, the kind that creates a dynamic in which deals can be made. But you have to get rid of that naivete. Because compromise, splitting the difference, can lead to terrible outcomes. Compromise is often a bad deal, and a key theme we'll hit in this chapter is that no deal is better than a bad deal. Even in a kidnapping. Yes. A bad deal in a kidnapping is where someone pays and no one comes out. To make my point on compromise, let me paint you an example. A woman wants her husband to wear black shoes with his suit. But her husband doesn't want to, he prefers brown shoes. So what do? They compromise, they meet halfway. And, you guessed it, he wears one black and one brown shoe. Is this the best outcome? No. In fact, that's the worst possible outcome. Either of the two other outcomes, black or brown, would be better than the compromise. Next time you want to compromise, remind yourself of those mismatched shoes. So why are we so infatuated with the notion of compromise if it often leads to poor results? The real problem with compromise is that it has come to be known as this great concept, in relationships and politics and everything else. Compromise, we are told quite simply, is a sacred moral good. Think back to the ransom demand. Fair is no ransom, and what the nephew wants is to pay nothing. So why is he going to offer $75,000, much less $150,000, for the ransom? There is no validity in the $150,000 request. With any compromise, the nephew ends up with a bizarrely bad result. I'm here to call bullshit on compromise right now. We don't compromise because it's right, we compromise because it is easy and because it saves face. We compromise in order to say that at least we got half the pie. Distilled to its essence, we compromise to be safe. Most people in a negotiation are driven by fear or by the desire to avoid pain. Too few are driven by their actual goals. So don't settle in. Here's a simple rule: never split the difference. Creative solutions are almost always preceded by some degree of risk, annoyance, confusion, and conflict. Accommodation and compromise produce none of that. You've got to embrace the hard stuff. That's where the great deals are. And that's what great negotiators do. Deadlines, make time your ally. Time is one of the most crucial variables in any negotiation. The simple passing of time and its sharper cousin, the deadline, are the screw that pressures every deal to a conclusion. Whether your deadline is real and absolute or merely a line in the sand, it can trick you into believing that doing a deal now is more important than getting a good deal. Deadlines regularly make people say and do impulsive things that are against their best interests, because we all have a natural tendency to rush as a deadline approaches. What good negotiators do is force themselves to resist this urge and take advantage of it in others. It's not so easy. Ask yourself, what is it about a deadline that causes pressure and anxiety? The answer is consequences. The perception of the loss we'll incur in the future. The deal is off. Our mind screams at us in some imaginary future scenario, should no resolution be achieved by a certain point in time. When you allow the variable of time to trigger such thinking, you have taken yourself hostage, creating an environment of reactive behaviors and poor choices, where your counterpart can now kick back and let an imaginary deadline, and your reaction to it, do all the work for him. Yes, I used the word imaginary. In all the years I've been doing work in the private sector, I've made it a point to ask nearly every entrepreneur and executive I've worked with whether, over the course of their entire careers, they have ever been a witness to or a party of a negotiation in which a missed deadline had negative repercussions. Among hundreds of such clients, there's one single, solitary gentleman who gave the question serious consideration and responded affirmatively. Deadlines are often arbitrary, almost always flexible, and hardly ever trigger the consequences we think, or are told, they will. Deadlines are the bogeyman of negotiation, almost exclusively self-inflicted figments of our imagination, unnecessarily unsettling us for no good reason. The mantra we coach our clients on is, no deal is better than a bad deal. If that mantra can truly be internalized, and clients begin to believe they've got all the time they need to conduct the negotiation right, their patience becomes a formidable weapon. A few weeks after the Haitian kidnapping boom began, we started to notice two patterns. First, Mondays seemed to be especially busy, as if the kidnappers had a particularly strong work ethic and wanted to get a jump on the week. And, second, the thugs grew increasingly eager to get paid as the weekend approached. At first, this didn't make any sense. But by listening closely to the kidnappers and debriefing the hostages we rescued, we discovered something that should have been obvious: these crimes weren't politically motivated at all. Instead, these guys were garden variety thugs who wanted to get paid by Friday so they could party through the weekend. Once we understood the pattern and knew the kidnappers' self-imposed deadline, we had two key pieces of information that totally shifted the leverage to our side. First, if we let the pressure build by stalling the negotiations until Thursday or Friday, we could cut the best deal. And, second, because you didn't need anything close to $150,000 to have a good weekend in Haiti, offering a lot less would suffice. How close we were getting to their self-imposed deadline would be indicated by how specific the threats were that they issued. "Give us the money or your aunt is going to die," is an early-stage threat, as the time isn't specified. Increasing specificity on threats in any type of negotiations indicates getting closer to real consequences at a real specified time. To gauge the level of a particular threat, we'd pay attention to how many of the 4 questions, what, who, when, and how, were addressed. When people issue threats, they consciously or subconsciously create ambiguities and loopholes they fully intend to exploit. As the loopholes started to close as the week progressed, and did so over and over again in similar ways with different kidnappings, the pattern emerged. With this information in hand, I came to expect the kidnappings to be orderly, 4-day events. It didn't make the abductions any more pleasant for the victim, but it certainly made them more predictable, and a whole lot cheaper, for the families on the other end. It's not just with hostage negotiations that deadlines can play into your hands. Car dealers are prone to give you the best price near the end of the month, when their transactions are assessed. And corporate salespeople work on a quarterly basis and are most vulnerable as the quarter comes to a close. Now, knowing how negotiators use their counterparts' deadlines to gain leverage would seem to suggest that it's best to keep your own deadline secret. And that's the advice you'll get from most old-school negotiation experts. In his best-selling 1980 book, You Can Negotiate Anything, one negotiation expert Herb Cohen tells the story of his first big business deal, when his company sent him to Japan to negotiate with a supplier. When he arrived, his counterparts asked him how long he was staying, and Cohen said a week. For the next 7 days, his hosts proceeded to entertain him with parties, tours, and outings, everything but negotiation. In fact, Cohen's counterparts didn't start serious talks until he was about to leave, and the two sides hammered out the deal's final details in the car to the airport. Cohen landed in the United States with the sinking feeling that he'd been played, and that he had conceded too much under deadline pressure. Would he have told them his deadline in retrospect? No, Cohen says, because it gave them a tool he didn't have. They knew my deadline, but I didn't know theirs. That mentality is everywhere these days. Seeing a simple rule to follow and assuming that a deadline is a strategic weakness, most negotiators follow Cohen's advice and hide their drop-dead date. Allow me to let you in on a little secret. Cohen, and the herd of negotiation experts who follow his lead, are wrong. Deadlines cut both ways. Cohen may well have been nervous about what his boss would say if he left Japan without an agreement. But it's also true that Cohen's counterparts wouldn't have one if he'd left without a deal. That's the key. When the negotiation is over for one side, it's over for the other too. In fact, Don Moore, a professor at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley, says that hiding a deadline actually puts the negotiator in the worst possible position. In his research, he's found that hiding your deadlines dramatically increases the risk of an impasse. That's because having a deadline pushes you to speed up your concessions, but the other side, thinking that it has time, will just hold out for more. Imagine if when NBA owners set a lockout deadline during contract negotiations they didn't tell the players' union. They would concede and concede as the deadline approached, inciting the union to keep negotiating past the secret deadline. In that sense, hiding a deadline means you're negotiating with yourself, and you always lose when you do so. Moore discovered that when negotiators tell their counterparts about their deadline, they get better deals. It's true. First, by revealing your cutoff you reduce the risk of impasse. And second, when an opponent knows your deadline, he'll get to the real deal and concession making more quickly. I've got one final point to make before we move on. deadlines are almost never ironclad. What's more important is engaging in the process and having a feel for how long that will take. You may see that you have more to accomplish than time will actually allow before the clock runs out. No such thing as fair. In the third week of my negotiations class, we play my favorite type of game, that is, the kind that shows my students how much they don't understand themselves. I know, I'm cruel. It's called the ultimatum game, and it goes like this. After the students split into pairs of a proposer and an acceptor, I give each proposer $10. The proposer then has to offer the acceptor a round number of dollars. If the acceptor agrees, he or she receives what's been offered and the proposer gets the rest. If the acceptor refuses the offer, though, they both get nothing and the $10 goes back to me. Whether they win and keep the money or lose and have to give it back is irrelevant, except to my wallet. What's important is the offer they make. The truly shocking thing is that, almost without exception, whatever selection anyone makes, they find themselves in a minority. No matter whether they chose $6/$4, $5/$5, $7/$3, $8/$2, etc., they look around and are inevitably surprised to find no split was chosen far more than any other. In something as simple as merely splitting $10 of found money, there is no consensus of what constitutes a fair or rational split. After we run this little experiment, I stand up in front of the class and make a point they don't like to hear. The reasoning each and every student used was 100% irrational and emotional. What? They say. I made a rational decision. Then I lay out how they're wrong. First, how could they all be using reason if so many have made different offers? That's the point, they didn't. They assumed the other guy would reason just like them. If you approach a negotiation thinking that the other guy thinks like you, you're wrong, I say. That's not empathy, that's projection. And then I push it even further. Why, I ask, did none of the proposers offer $1, which is the best rational offer for them and logically unrejectable for the acceptor? And if they did and they got rejected, which happens, why did the acceptor turn them down? Anyone who made any offer other than $1 made an emotional choice, I say. And for you acceptors who turned down $1, since when is getting $0 better than getting $1? Did the rules of finance suddenly change? This rocks my students' view of themselves as rational actors. But they're not. None of us are. We're all irrational, all emotional. Emotion is a necessary element to decision-making that we ignore at our own peril. Realizing that hits people hard between the eyes. In Descartes' error, emotion, reason, and the human brain, two neuroscientist Antonio Damasio explained a groundbreaking discovery he made. Studying people who had damage in the part of the brain where emotions are generated, he found that they all had something peculiar in common: they couldn't make decisions. They could describe what they should do in logical terms, but they found it impossible to make even the simplest choice. In other words, while we may use logic to reason ourselves toward a decision, the actual decision-making is governed by emotion. The F word, why it's so powerful, when to use it, and how. The most powerful word in negotiations is fair. As human beings, we're mightily swayed by how much we feel we have been respected. People comply with agreements if they feel they've been treated fairly and lash out if they don't. A decade of brain imaging studies has shown that human neural activity, particularly in the emotion-regulating insular cortex, reflects the degree of unfairness in social interactions. Even non-human primates are hardwired to reject unfairness. In one famous study, 2 Capuchin monkeys were set to perform the same task, but one was rewarded with sweet grapes while the other received cucumbers. In response to such blatant unfairness, the cucumber-fed monkey literally went bananas. In the ultimatum game, years of experience has shown me that most acceptors will invariably reject any offer that is less than half of the proposer's money. Once you get to a quarter of the proposer's money, you can forget it and the acceptors are insulted. Most people make an irrational choice to let the dollar slip through their fingers rather than to accept a derisory offer, because the negative emotional value of unfairness outweighs the positive rational value of the money. This irrational reaction to unfairness extends all the way to serious economic deals. Remember Robin Williams's great work as the voice of the genie in Disney's Aladdin? Because he wanted to leave something wonderful behind for his kids, he said, he did the voice for a cut-rate fee of $75,000, far below his usual $8 million payday. But then something happened. The movie became a huge hit, raking in $504 million. And Williams went ballistic. Now look at this with the ultimatum game in mind. Williams wasn't angry because of the money, it was the perceived unfairness that pissed him off. He didn't complain about his contract until Aladdin became a blockbuster, and then he and his agent went loud and long about how they got ripped off. Lucky for Williams, Disney wanted to keep its star happy. After initially pointing out the obvious, that he'd happily signed the deal, Disney made the dramatic gesture of sending the star a Picasso painting worth a reported $1 million. The nation of Iran was not so lucky. In recent years, Iran has put up with sanctions that have cost it well over $100 billion in foreign investment and oil revenue in order to defend a uranium-enriching nuclear program that can only meet 2% of its energy needs. In other words, like the students who won't take a free $1 because the offer seems insulting, Iran has screwed itself out of its chief source of income, oil and gas revenue, in order to pursue an energy project with little expected payoff. Why? Again, fairness. For Iran, it's not fair that the global powers, which together have several thousand nuclear weapons, should be able to decide if it can use nuclear energy. And why, Iran wonders, is it considered a pariah for enriching uranium when India and Pakistan, which clandestinely acquired nuclear weapons, are accepted members of the international community? In a TV interview, former Iranian nuclear negotiator Saeed Hossein Mousavian hit the nail on the head. The nuclear issue today for Iranians is not nuclear, he said, it's defending their integrity, as an independent identity against the pressure of the rest. You may not trust Iran, but its moves are pretty clear evidence that rejecting perceived unfairness, even at substantial cost, is a powerful motivation. Once you understand what a messy, emotional, and destructive dynamic fairness can be, you can see why fair is a tremendously powerful word that you need to use with care. In fact, of the 3 ways that people drop this F-bomb, only one is positive. The most common use is a judo-like defensive move that destabilizes the other side. This manipulation usually takes the form of something like, "We just want what's fair." Think back to the last time someone made this implicit accusation of unfairness to you, and I bet you'll have to admit that it immediately triggered feelings of defensiveness and discomfort. These feelings are often subconscious and often lead to an irrational concession. A friend of mine was selling her Boston home in a bust market a few years back. The offer she got was much lower than she wanted. It meant a big loss for her, and out of frustration she dropped this F-bomb on the prospective buyer. "We just want what's fair," she said. Emotionally rattled by the implicit accusation, the guy raised his offer immediately. If you're on the business end of this accusation, you need to realize that the other side might not be trying to pick your pocket. Like my friend, they might just be overwhelmed by circumstance. The best response either way is to take a deep breath and restrain your desire to concede. Then say, "Okay, I apologize. Let's stop everything and go back to where I started treating you unfairly and we'll fix it." The second use of the F-bomb is more nefarious. In this one, your counterpart will basically accuse you of being dense or dishonest by saying, "We've given you a fair offer." It's a terrible little jab meant to distract your attention and manipulate you into giving in. Whenever someone tries this on me, I think back to the last NFL lockout. Negotiations were getting down to the wire, and the NFL Players Association, NFLPA, said that before they agreed to a final deal, they wanted the owners to open their books. The owners answer: "We've given the players a fair offer." Notice the horrible genius of this. Instead of opening their books or declining to do so, the owners shifted the focus to the NFLPA's supposed lack of understanding of fairness. If you find yourself in this situation, the best reaction is to simply mirror the F that has just been lobbed at you. Fair, you'd respond, pausing to let the word's power do to them as it was intended to do to you. Follow that with a label. It seems like you're ready to provide the evidence that supports that, which alludes to opening their books or otherwise handing over information that will either contradict their claim to fairness or give you more data to work with than you had previously. Right away, you declaw the attack. The last use of the F word is my favorite because it's positive and constructive. It sets the stage for honest and empathetic negotiation. Here's how I use it. Early on in a negotiation, I say, "I want you to feel like you are being treated fairly at all times. So please stop me at any time if you feel I'm being unfair, and we'll address it." It's simple and clear and sets me up as an honest dealer. With that statement, I let people know it is okay to use that word with me if they use it honestly. As a negotiator, you should strive for a reputation of being fair. Your reputation precedes you. Let it precede you in a way that paves success. How to discover the emotional drivers behind what the other party values. A few years ago, I stumbled upon the book How to Become a Rainmaker 3, and I like to review it occasionally to refresh my sense of the emotional drivers that fuel decisions. The book does a great job to explain the sales job not as a rational argument, but as an emotional framing job. If you can get the other party to reveal their problems, pain, and unmet objectives, if you can get at what people are really buying, then you can sell them a vision of their problem that leaves your proposal as the perfect solution. Look at this from the most basic level. What does a good babysitter sell, really? It's not child care exactly, but a relaxed evening. A furnace salesperson. Cozy rooms for family time. A locksmith. A feeling of security. Know the emotional drivers and you can frame the benefits of any deal in language that will resonate. Bend their reality. Take the same person, change one or two variables, and $100 can be a glorious victory or a vicious insult. Recognizing this phenomenon lets you bend reality from insult to victory. Let me give you an example. I have this coffee mug, red and white with the Swiss flag. No chips, but used. What would you pay for it, deep down in your heart of hearts? You're probably going to say something like $3.50. Let's say it's your mug now. You're going to sell it to me. So tell me what it's worth. You're probably going to say something between $5 and $7. In both cases, it was the exact same mug. All I did was move the mug in relation to you, and I totally changed its value. Or imagine that I offer you $20 to run a 3-minute errand and get me a cup of coffee. You're going to think to yourself that $20 for 3 minutes is $400 an hour. You're going to be thrilled. What if then you find out that by getting you to run that errand I made $1 million? You'd go from being ecstatic for making $400 an hour to being angry because you got ripped off. The value of the $20, just like the value of the coffee mug, didn't change. But your perspective of it did. Just by how I position the $20, I can make you happy or disgusted by it. I tell you that not to expose our decision-making as emotional and irrational. We've already seen that. What I am saying is that while our decisions may be largely irrational, that doesn't mean there aren't consistent patterns, principles, and rules behind how we act. And once you know those mental patterns, you start to see ways to influence them. By far the best theory for describing the principles of our irrational decisions is something called prospect theory. Created in 1979 by the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, prospect theory describes how people choose between options that involve risk, like in a negotiation. The theory argues that people are drawn to sure things over probabilities, even when the probability is a better choice. That's called the certainty effect. And people will take greater risks to avoid losses than to achieve gains. That's called loss aversion. That's why people who statistically have no need for insurance buy it. Or consider this: a person who's told he has a 95% chance of receiving $10,000 or a 100% chance of getting $9,499 will usually avoid risk and take the 100% certain safe choice. While the same person who's told he has a 95% chance of losing $10,000 or a 100% chance of losing $9,499 will make the opposite choice, risking the bigger 95% option to avoid the loss. The chance for loss incites more risk than the possibility of an equal gain. Over the next few pages I'll explain a few prospect theory tactics you can use to your advantage. But first let me leave you with a crucial lesson about loss aversion. In a tough negotiation, it's not enough to show the other party that you can deliver the thing they want. To get real leverage, you have to persuade them that they have something concrete to lose if the deal falls through. 1. Anchor their emotions. To bend your counterpart's reality, you have to start with the basics of empathy. So start out with an accusation audit, acknowledging all of their fears. By anchoring their emotions in preparation for a loss, you inflame the other side's loss aversion so that they'll jump at the chance to avoid it. On my first consulting project after leaving the FBI, I received the honor to train the National Hostage Negotiation Team for the United Arab Emirates. Unfortunately, the prestige of the assignment was tempered during the project by problems with the general contractor. I was a subcontractor. The problems became so bad that I was going to have to go back to the contractors I'd signed up, who normally got $2,000 a day, and tell them that for several months, I could only offer $500. I knew exactly what they would do if I just told them straight out. They'd laugh me out of town. So I got each of them on the phone and hit them hard with an accusation audit. "I got a lousy proposition for you," I said, and paused until each asked me to go on. "By the time we get off the phone, you're going to think I'm a lousy businessman. You're going to think I can't budget or plan. You're going to think Chris Voss is a big talker. His first big project ever out of the FBI, he screws it up completely. He doesn't know how to run an operation. And he might even have lied to me." And then, once I'd anchored their emotions in a minefield of low expectations, I played on their loss aversion. "Still, I wanted to bring this opportunity to you before I took it to someone else," I said. Suddenly, their call wasn't about being cut from $2,000 to $500 but how not to lose $500 to some other guy. Every single one of them took the deal. No counteroffers, no complaints. Now, if I hadn't anchored their emotions low, their perception of $500 would have been totally different. If I just called and said, "I can give you $500 per day," what do you think? They'd have taken it as an insult and slammed down the phone. 2. Let the other guy go first. Most of the time. Now, it's clear that the benefits of anchoring emotions are great when it comes to bending your counterpart's reality. But going first is not necessarily the best thing when it comes to negotiating price. When the famous film director Billy Wilder went to hire the famous detective novelist Raymond Chandler to write the 1944 classic Double Indemnity, Chandler was new to Hollywood. But he came ready to negotiate, and in his meeting with Wilder and the movie's producer, Chandler made the first salary offer. He bluffly demanded $150 per week and warned Wilder that it might take him 3 weeks to finish the project. Wilder and the producer could barely stop from laughing, because they had been planning to pay Chandler $750 per week and they knew that movie scripts took months to write. Lucky for Chandler, Wilder and the producer valued their relationship with Chandler more than a few $100s, so they took pity on him and called an agent to represent Chandler in the negotiations. Similarly, I had a student named Jerry who royally screwed up his salary negotiation by going first. Let me say that this happened before he was my student. In an interview at a New York financial firm, he demanded $110,000, in large part because it represented a 30% raise. It was only after he started that he realized that the firm had started everybody else in his program at $125,000. That's why I suggest you let the other side anchor monetary negotiations. The real issue is that neither side has perfect information going to the table. This often means you don't know enough to open with confidence. That's especially true anytime you don't know the market value of what you are buying or selling, like with Jerry or Chandler. By letting them anchor you also might get lucky. I've experienced many negotiations when the other party's first offer was higher than the closing figure I had in mind. If I'd gone first they would have agreed and I would have left with either the winner's curse or buyer's remorse, those gut-wrenching feelings that you've overpaid or undersold. That said, you've got to be careful when you let the other guy anchor. You have to prepare yourself psychically to withstand the first offer. If the other guy's a pro, a shark, he's going to go for an extreme anchor in order to bend your reality. Then, when they come back with a merely absurd offer, it will seem reasonable, just like an expensive $400 iPhone seems reasonable after they mark it down from a crazy $600. The tendency to be anchored by extreme numbers is a psychological quirk known as the anchor and adjustment effect. Researchers have discovered that we tend to make adjustments from our first reference points. For example, most people glimpsing 8 by 7 by 6 times 5 by 4 by 3 times 2 by 1 estimate that it yields a higher result than the same string in reverse order. That's because we focus on the first numbers and extrapolate. That's not to say, never open. Rules like that are easy to remember, but, like most simplistic approaches, they are not always good advice. If you're dealing with a rookie counterpart, you might be tempted to be the shark and throw out an extreme anchor. Or if you really know the market and you're dealing with an equally informed pro, you might offer a number just to make the negotiation go faster. Here's my personal advice on whether or not you want to be the shark that eats a rookie counterpart. Just remember, your reputation precedes you. I've run into CEOs whose reputation was to always badly beat their counterpart and pretty soon no one would deal with them. 3. Establish a range. While going first rarely helps, there is one way to seem to make an offer and bend their reality in the process. That is, by alluding to a range. What I mean is this: when confronted with naming your terms or price, counter by recalling a similar deal which establishes your ballpark, albeit the best possible ballpark you wish to be in. Instead of saying, "I'm worth $110,000, Jerry might have said, "At top places like X Corporation, people in this job get between $130,000 and $170,000. That gets your point across without moving the other party into a defensive position. And it gets him thinking at higher levels. Research shows that people who hear extreme anchors unconsciously adjust their expectations in the direction of the opening number. Many even go directly to their price limit. If Jerry had given this range, the firm probably would have offered $130,000 because it looked so cheap next to $170,000. In a recent study for Columbia Business School, psychologists found that job applicants who named a range received significantly higher overall salaries than those who offered a number, especially if their range was a bolstering range, in which the low number in the range was what they actually wanted. Understand, if you offer a range, and it's a good idea to do so, expect them to come in at the low end. 4. Pivot to non-monetary terms. People get hung up on how much. But don't deal with numbers in isolation. That leads to bargaining, a series of rigid positions defined by emotional views of fairness and pride. Negotiation is a more intricate and subtle dynamic than that. One of the easiest ways to bend your counterpart's reality to your point of view is by pivoting to non-monetary terms. After you've anchored them high, you can make your offer seem reasonable by offering things that aren't important to you but could be important to them. Or if their offer is low, you could ask for things that matter more to you than them. Since this is sometimes difficult, what we often do is throw out examples to start the brainstorming process. Not long ago, I did some training for the Memphis Bar Association. Normally, for the training they were looking for, I'd charge $25,000 a day. They came in with a much lower offer that I balked at. They then offered to do a cover story about me in their association magazine. For me to be on the cover of a magazine that went out to who knows how many of the country's top lawyers was priceless advertising. Plus my mom is really proud of it. They had to put something on the cover anyway, so it had zero cost to them and I gave them a steep discount on my fee. I constantly use that as an example in my negotiations now when I name a price. I want to stimulate my counterparts' brainstorming to see what valuable non-monetary gems they might have that are cheap to them but valuable to me. 5. When you do talk numbers, use odd ones. Every number has a psychological significance that goes beyond its value. And I'm not just talking about how you love 17 because you think it's lucky. What I mean is that, in terms of negotiation, some numbers appear more immovable than others. The biggest thing to remember is that numbers that end in 0 inevitably feel like temporary placeholders, guesstimates that you can easily be negotiated off of. But anything you throw out that sounds less rounded, say, $37,263, feels like a figure that you came to as a result of thoughtful calculation. Such numbers feel serious and permanent to your counterpart, so use them to fortify your offers. 6. Surprise with a gift. You can get your counterpart into a mood of generosity by staking an extreme anchor and then, after their inevitable first rejection, offering them a wholly unrelated surprise gift. Unexpected conciliatory gestures like this are hugely effective because they introduce a dynamic called reciprocity. The other party feels the need to answer your generosity in kind. They will suddenly come up on their offer, or they'll look to repay your kindness in the future. People feel obliged to repay debts of kindness. Let's look at it in terms of international politics. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat dramatically pushed negotiations on the Egypt-Israel peace treaty forward by making a surprise address to the Israeli Knesset, a generous gesture that did not involve making any actual concessions but did signify a big step toward peace. Back in Haiti, a few hours after the kidnappers had snatched his aunt, I was on the phone with the politician's nephew. There was no way their family could come up with $150,000, he told me, but they could pay between $50,000 and $85,000. But since learning that the ransom was just party money, I was aiming much lower, $5,000. We were not going to compromise. It was a matter of professional pride. I advised him to start off by anchoring the conversation in the idea that he didn't have the money, but to do so without saying no, so as not to hit their pride head-on. How am I supposed to do that? He asked in the next call. The kidnapper made another general threat against the aunt and again demanded the cash. That's when I had the nephew subtly question the kidnapper's fairness. I'm sorry, the nephew responded, but how are we supposed to pay if you're going to hurt her? That brought up the aunt's death, which was the thing the kidnappers most wanted to avoid. They needed to keep her unharmed if they hoped to get any money. They were commodity traders, after all. Notice that to this point the nephew hadn't named a price. This game of attrition finally pushed the kidnappers to name a number first. Without prodding, they dropped to $50,000. Now that the kidnapper's reality had been bent to a smaller number, my colleagues and I told the nephew to stand his ground. How can I come up with that kind of money? we told him to ask. Again, the kidnapper dropped his demand to $25,000. Now that we had him in our sights, we had the nephew make his first offer, an extreme low anchor of $3,000. The line went silent and the nephew began to sweat profusely, but we told him to hold tight. This always happened at the moment the kidnapper's economic reality got totally rearranged. When he spoke again, the kidnapper seemed shell-shocked. But he went on. His next offer was lower, $10,000. Then we had the nephew answer with a strange number that seemed to come from deep calculation of what his aunt's life was worth, $4,751. His new price, $7,500. In response, we had the cousin spontaneously say he'd throw in a new portable CD stereo and repeated the $4,751. The kidnappers, who didn't really want the CD stereo, felt there was no more money to be had, said yes. 6 hours later, the family paid that sum and the aunt came back home safely. How to negotiate a better salary. One of the critical factors in business school rankings is how well their graduates are compensated. So I tell every MBA class I lecture that my first objective is to single-handedly raise the ranking of their school by teaching them how to negotiate a better salary. I break down the process into 3 parts that blend this chapter's dynamics in a way that not only brings you better money, but convinces your boss to fight to get it for you. Be pleasantly persistent on non-salary terms. Pleasant persistence is a kind of emotional anchoring that creates empathy with the boss and builds the right psychological environment for constructive discussion. And the more you talk about non-salary terms, the more likely you are to hear the full range of their options. If they can't meet your non-salary requests, they may even counter with more money, like they did with a French-born American former student of mine. She kept asking, with a big smile, for an extra week of vacation beyond what the company normally gave. She was French, she said, and that's what French people did. The hiring company was completely handcuffed on the vacation issue, but because she was so darn delightful, and because she introduced a non-monetary variable into the notion of her value, they countered by increasing her salary offer. Salary terms without success terms is Russian roulette. Once you've negotiated a salary, make sure to define success for your position, as well as metrics for your next raise. That's meaningful for you and free for your boss, much like giving me a magazine cover story was for the bar association. It gets you a planned raise and, by defining your success in relation to your boss's supervision, it leads into the next step. Spark their interest in your success and gain an unofficial mentor. Remember the idea of figuring what the other side is really buying. Well, when you are selling yourself to a manager, sell yourself as more than a body for a job. Sell yourself and your success as a way they can validate their own intelligence and broadcast it to the rest of the company. Make sure they know you'll act as a flesh and blood argument for their importance. Once you've bent their reality to include you as their ambassador, they'll have a stake in your success. Ask, what does it take to be successful here? Please notice that this question is similar to questions that are suggested by many MBA career counseling centers, yet not exactly the same. And it's the exact wording of this question that's critical. Students from my MBA courses who have asked this question in job interviews have actually had interviewers lean forward and say, "No one ever asked us that before." The interviewer then gave a great and detailed answer. The key issue here is if someone gives you guidance, they will watch to see if you follow their advice. They will have a personal stake in seeing you succeed. You've just recruited your first unofficial mentor. To show how this can be done to near perfection, I can think of no better example than my former MBA student Angel Prado. While Angel was finishing up his MBA, he went to his boss and began to lay the groundwork for his work post-MBA, which the company was paying. During his last semester, he set a non-specific anchor, a kind of range, by suggesting to his boss that once he graduated and the company was done investing in his MBA, around $31,000 per year, that money should go to him as salary. His boss made no commitment, but Angel was pleasantly persistent about it, which set the idea as an anchor in his boss's mind. Upon graduation, Angel and his boss had their big sit-down. In an assertive and calm manner, Angel broached a non-financial issue to move the focus away from how much he asked for a new title. Angel's boss readily agreed that a new role was a no-brainer after Angel's new degree. At that point, Angel and his manager defined what his roles and responsibilities would be in his new role, thereby setting success metrics. Then Angel took a breath and paused so that his boss would be the first to throw out a number. At last, he did. Curiously enough, the numbers showed that Angel's earlier efforts at anchoring had worked. He proposed to add $31,000 to Angel's base salary, almost a 50% raise. But Angel was no rookie negotiator, not after taking my class. So instead of countering and getting stuck in how much, he kept talking, labeling the boss's emotions and empathizing with his situation. At the time, the company was going through difficult negotiations with its investors. And then Angel courteously asked for a moment to step away and print up the agreed-upon job description. This pause created a dynamic of pre-deadline urgency in his boss, which Angel exploited when he returned with the printout. On the bottom, he'd added his desired compensation, $134.5K, $143,000. In that one little move, Angel weaved together a bunch of the lessons from this chapter. The odd numbers gave them the weight of thoughtful calculation. The numbers were high too, which exploited his boss's natural tendency to go directly to his price limit when faced by an extreme anchor. And they were a range, which made Angel seem less aggressive and the lower end more reasonable in comparison. From his boss's body language, raised eyebrows, it was clear that he was surprised by the compensation request. But it had the desired effect. After some comments about the description, he countered with $120,000. Angel didn't say no or yes, but kept talking and creating empathy. Then, in the middle of a sentence, seemingly out of the blue, his boss threw out $127,000. With his boss obviously negotiating with himself, Angel kept him going. Finally, his boss said he agreed with the $134,500 and would pay that salary starting in 3 months, contingent on the board of directors' approval. As the icing on the cake, Angel worked in a positive use of the word fair. "That's fair," he said, and then sold the raise to his boss as a marriage in which his boss would be the mentor. "I'm asking you, not the board, for the promotion, and all I need is for you to agree with it," he said. And how did Angel's boss reply to his new ambassador? "I'll fight to get you this salary." So follow Angel's lead and make it rain. Key lessons. Compared to the tools discussed in previous chapters, the techniques here seem concrete and easy to use. But many people shy away from them because they seem manipulative. Something that bends your counterpart's reality must be cheating, right? In response, let me just say that these tools are used by all the best negotiators because they simply recognize the human psyche as it is. We are emotional, irrational beasts who are emotional and irrational in predictable, pattern-filled ways. Using that knowledge is only, well, rational. As you work these tools into your daily life, remember the following powerful lessons. All negotiations are defined by a network of subterranean desires and needs. Don't let yourself be fooled by the surface. Once you know that the Haitian kidnappers just want party money, you will be miles better prepared. Splitting the difference is wearing one black and one brown shoe, so don't compromise. Meeting halfway often leads to bad deals for both sides. Approaching deadlines entice people to rush the negotiating process and do impulsive things that are against their best interests. The F word, fair, is an emotional term people usually exploit to put the other side on the defensive and gain concessions. When your counterpart drops the F-bomb, don't get suckered into a concession. Instead, ask them to explain how you're mistreating them. You can bend your counterpart's reality by anchoring his starting point. Before you make an offer, emotionally anchor them by saying how bad it will be. When you get to numbers, set an extreme anchor to make your real offer seem reasonable, or use a range to seem less aggressive. The real value of anything depends on what vantage point you're looking at it from. People will take more risks to avoid a loss than to realize a gain. Make sure your counterpart sees that there is something to lose by inaction. Chapter 7. Create the illusion of control. A month after I'd finished working the case of Jeffrey Schilling in May 2001, I got orders from headquarters to head back to Manila. The same bad guys who'd taken Schilling, a brutal group of radical Islamists named the Abu Sayyaf, had raided the Dos Palmas private diving resort and taken 20 hostages, including 3 Americans, Martin and Gracia Burnham, a missionary couple from Wichita, Kansas, and Guillermo Sabero, a guy who ran a California waterproofing firm. Dos Palmas was a negotiator's nightmare from the start. The day after the kidnappings, the recently elected Philippine president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, set up the most confrontational, non-constructive dynamic possible by publicly declaring all-out war on the Abu Sayyaf. Not exactly empathetic discourse, right? It got a lot worse. The Philippine Army and Marines had a turf war in the midst of the negotiations, pissing off the kidnappers with several botched raids. Because American hostages were involved, the CIA, the FBI, and U.S. military intelligence were all called in and we too squabbled among ourselves. Then the kidnappers raped and killed several hostages, 9/11 happened, and the Abu Sayyaf was linked to Al-Qaeda. By the time the crisis concluded in an orgy of gunshots in June 2002, Dos Palmas had officially become the biggest failure in my professional life. To call it a train wreck would be generous, if you know what I mean. But failures plant the seeds of future success, and our failure in the Philippines was no exception. If the Dos Palmas calamity showed me anything, it was that we all were still suffering under the notion that negotiation was a wrestling match where the point is to exhaust your opponent into submission, hope for the best, and never back down. As my disappointment with Dos Palmas forced me to reckon with our failed techniques, I took a deep look into the newest negotiating theories, some great and some completely harebrained, and I had a chance encounter with a case in Pittsburgh that completely changed how I looked at the interpersonal dynamics of negotiation conversations. From the ashes of Dos Palmas, then, we learned a lesson that would forever change how the FBI negotiated kidnappings. We learned that negotiation was coaxing, not overcoming, co-opting, not defeating. Most important, we learned that successful negotiation involved getting your counterpart to do the work for you and suggest your solution himself. It involved giving him the illusion of control while you, in fact, were the one defining the conversation. The tool we developed is something I call the calibrated, or open-ended, question. What it does is remove aggression from conversations by acknowledging the other side openly, without resistance. In doing so, it lets you introduce ideas and requests without sounding pushy. It allows you to nudge. I'll explain it in depth later on, but for now let me say that it's really as simple as removing the hostility from the statement, "You can't leave," and turning it into a question. What do you hope to achieve by going? Don't try to negotiate in a firefight. The moment I arrived in Manila on the Burnham-Sabero case, I was sent down to the Mindanao region, where the Philippine military was lobbing bullets and rockets into a hospital complex where the Abu Sayyaf and the hostages were holed up. This was no place for a negotiator, because it's impossible to have a dialogue in the middle of a firefight. Then things got worse. When I woke up the next morning, I learned that during the night the kidnappers had taken their hostages and escaped. The escape was the first sign that this operation was going to be a rolling train wreck and that the Philippine military was less than a trustworthy partner. During debriefings following the episode, it was revealed that during a ceasefire a military guy had collected a suitcase from the thugs in the hospital, and not long after that all the soldiers on the rear perimeter of the hospital had been called away for a meeting. Coincidentally, or not, the bad guys chose that moment to slip away. Things really blew up 2 weeks later, on the Philippines' Independence Day, when Abu Sabaya announced that he was going to behead one of the whites unless the government called off its manhunt by midday. We knew this meant one of the Americans and anticipated it would be Guillermo Sabero. We didn't have any direct contact with the kidnappers at the time because our partners in the Philippine military had assigned us an intermediary who always forgot to make sure we were present for his phone calls with the kidnappers, and similarly, forgot to tape them. All we could do was send text messages offering to schedule a time to speak. What ended up happening was that just before the noon deadline, Sabaya and a member of the Philippine presidential cabinet had a conversation on a radio talk show, and the government conceded to Sabaya's demand to name a Malaysian senator as a negotiator. In exchange, Sabaya agreed not to kill a hostage. But it was too late to fix this atmosphere of confrontation, distrust, and lies. That afternoon, the hostages heard Sabaya on the phone yelling, but that was part of the agreement. That was a part of the agreement. Not long after, the Abu Sayyaf beheaded Guillermo Sabero, and for good measure the group took 15 more hostages. With none of the important moving parts anywhere near under our control and the United States largely uninterested in spite of Sabero's murder, I headed back to Washington, D.C. It seemed like there was little we could do. Then 9/11 changed everything. Once a minor terrorist outfit, the Abu Sayyaf was suddenly linked to Al-Qaeda. And then a Philippine TV reporter named Arlene de la Cruz got into the Abu Sayyaf camp and videotaped Sabaya as he taunted the American missionaries Martin and Gracia Burnham, who were so emaciated they looked like concentration camp survivors. The video hit the U.S. news media like thunder. Suddenly, the case became a major U.S. government priority. There is always a team on the other side. The FBI sent me back in. Now I was sent in to make sure a deal got made. It was all very high profile, too. Some of my contacts reported that FBI Director Robert Mueller was personally briefing President George W. Bush every morning on what we were doing. When Director Mueller showed up in the U.S. Embassy in Manila and I was introduced to him, a look of recognition came over his face. That was a very heady moment. But all the support in the world won't work if your counterpart's team is dysfunctional. If your negotiation efforts don't reach past your counterpart and into the team behind him, then you've got a hope-based deal, and hope is not a strategy. One of the things I failed to fully appreciate then was that the kidnappers had changed negotiators themselves. Sabaya had been replaced. My boss Gary Nosner had, in a previous kidnapping, pointed out to me that a change in negotiators by the other side almost always signaled that they meant to take a harder line. What I didn't realize at the time was this meant Sabaya was going to play a role as a deal breaker if he wasn't accounted for. Our new tack was to buy the Benhams back. Although the United States officially doesn't pay ransoms, a donor had been found who would provide $300,000. The new Abu Sayyaf negotiator agreed to a release. The ransom drop was a disaster. The kidnappers decided that they wouldn't release the Benhams, or, rather, Sabaya, who was physically in charge of the hostages, refused to release them. He had cut his own side deal, one we didn't know about, and it had fallen through. The new negotiator, now embarrassed and in a foul mood, covered himself by claiming that the payment was short $600. We were baffled. $600. You won't let hostages go because of $600. And we tried to argue that if the money was missing, it must have been the courier who had stolen the money. But we had no dynamic of trust and cooperation to back us up. The $300,000 was gone and we were back to rarely answered text messages. The slow-motion wreck culminated about 2 months later with a botched rescue. A team of Philippine Scout Rangers walking around in the woods came across the Abu Sayyaf camp, or so they said. Later we heard another government agency had tipped them off. That other government agency, OGA, had not told us about their location because... Why? That's something I will never understand. The Scout Rangers formed a skirmish line from a tree line above the camp and opened fire, indiscriminately pouring bullets into the area. Gracia and Martin were taking a nap in their hammocks when the fire started raining down. They both fell out of their hammocks and started to roll down the hill towards safety. But as a sheet of bullets from their rescuers fell on them, Gracia felt a searing burn flare through her right thigh. And then, she felt Martin go limp. Minutes later, after the last rebels fled, the squad of Philippine soldiers tried to reassure Gracia that her husband was fine, but she shook her head. After a year in captivity, she had no time for fantasies. Gracia knew her husband was dead, and she was right. He'd been hit in the chest, 3 times, by friendly fire. In the end, the supposed rescue mission killed 2 of the 3 hostages there that day. A Philippine nurse named Edibora Yap also died, and the big fish, Sabaya, escaped to live a few more months. From beginning to end, the 13-month mission was a complete failure, a waste of lives and treasure. As I sat in the dark at home a few days later, dispirited and spent, I knew that something had to change. We couldn't let this happen again. If the hostages' deaths were going to mean something, we would have to find a new way to negotiate, communicate, listen, and speak, both with our enemies and with our friends. Not for communication's sake, though. No. We had to do it to win. Avoid a showdown. No 2 ways about it, my return to the United States was a time of reckoning. I questioned, I even doubted, some of what we were doing at the FBI. If what we knew wasn't enough, we had to get better. The real kick in the pants came after my return, when I was reviewing information about the case, a lot of which we hadn't had in the field. Among the piles of information was one fact that totally blew my mind. Martin Burnham had been overheard on a phone call to someone. I wondered what in God's name our hostage was doing talking on the phone without us knowing. And with whom was he talking? There's only one reason a hostage ever gets on a phone. It's to provide proof of life. Someone else had been trying to ransom the Burnhams out. It turned out to be someone working for a crooked Philippine politician who'd been running a parallel negotiation for the Burnhams' release. He wanted to buy the hostages out himself in order to show up Philippine President Arroyo. But it wasn't so much that this guy was going behind our backs that bothered me. As is pretty clear already, there were a whole lot of underhanded things going on. What really ate at me was that this schmuck, who wasn't an FBI-trained hostage negotiator, had pulled off something that I hadn't been able to. He'd gotten to speak to Martin Burnham on the phone for free. That's when I realized that this crooked Pole's success where we had failed was a kind of metaphor for everything that was wrong with our one-dimensional mindset. Beyond our problems with the Philippine military, the big reason we had no effective influence with the kidnappers and hostages was that we had this very tit-for-tat mentality. Under that mentality, if we called up the bad guys we were asking for something, and if they gave it to us we had to give them something back. And so, because we were positive that the Burnhams were alive, we'd never bothered to call and ask for proof of life. We were afraid to go into debt. If we made an ask and they granted it, we'd owe. Not making good on a debt risked the accusation of bad faith negotiation, and bad faith in kidnappings gets people killed. And of course we didn't ask the kidnappers to talk directly to the hostage because we knew they'd say no, and we were afraid of being embarrassed. That fear was a major flaw in our negotiating mindset. There is some information that you can only get through direct, extended interactions with your counterpart. We also needed new ways to get things without asking for them. We needed to finesse making an ask with something more sophisticated than closed-ended questions with their yes-no dynamic. That's when I realized that what we had been doing wasn't communication, it was verbal flexing. We wanted them to see things our way and they wanted us to see it their way. If you let this dynamic loose in the real world, negotiation breaks down and tensions flare. That whole ethos permeated everything the FBI was doing. Everything was a showdown. And it didn't work. Our approach to proof-of-life questions embodied all these problems. At the time, we proved that our hostages were alive by devising questions that asked for a piece of information only the hostage could know. Computer security-style questions, like, what's the name of Martin's first dog, or what's Martin's dad's middle name? This particular type of question had many failings, however. For one thing, it had sort of become a signature of law enforcement in the kidnapping world. When a family starts asking a question of that type, it's a near certainty that the cops are coaching them. And that makes kidnappers very nervous. Even beyond the nerves, you had the problem that answering questions like those required little, if any, effort. The bad guys go and get the fact and give it to you right away, because it's so easy. Bang, bang, bang. It happens so fast that you didn't gain any tactical advantage, any usable information, any effort on their part toward a goal that serves you. And all negotiation, done well, should be an information gathering process that vests your counterpart in an outcome that serves you. Worst of all, the bad guys know that they have just given you something, a proof of life, which triggers this whole human reciprocity gene. Whether we like to recognize it or not, a universal rule of human nature, across all cultures, is that when somebody gives you something, they expect something in return. And they won't give anything else until you pay them back. Now, we didn't want to trigger this whole reciprocity thing because we didn't want to give anything. So what happened? All of our conversations became these paralyzed confrontations between two parties who wanted to extract something from each other but didn't want to give. We didn't communicate, out of pride and fear. That's why we failed, while numbskulls like this crooked Philippine politician just stumbled in and got what we so desperately needed. That is, communication without reciprocity. I sat back and wondered to myself, how the hell do we do that? Suspend unbelief. While I was racking my brains over how this sleazy politician managed to get Martin Burnham on the phone while we never could, FBI Pittsburgh had a kidnapping case. My partner Chuck brought me the tapes from the case because he thought it was funny. You see, one Pittsburgh drug dealer had kidnapped the girlfriend of another Pittsburgh drug dealer, and for whatever reason the victim drug dealer came to the FBI for help. Coming to the FBI seemed kind of contrary to his best interests, being a drug dealer and all, but he did it because no matter who you are, when you need help you go to the FBI. Right? On the tapes, our hostage negotiators are riding around with this drug dealer while he's negotiating with the other drug dealer. Normally we would have had the guy ask a bulletproof proof-of-life question, like, what was the name of the girlfriend's teddy bear when she was little? But in this situation, this drug dealer hadn't yet been coached on asking a correct question. So in the middle of the conversation with the kidnapper, he just blurts, "Hey, dog, how do I know she's all right?" And the funniest thing happened. The kidnapper actually went silent for 10 seconds. He was completely taken aback. Then he said, in a much less confrontational tone of voice, "Well, I'll put her on the phone." I was floored because this unsophisticated drug dealer just pulled off a phenomenal victory in the negotiation. To get the kidnapper to volunteer to put the victim on the phone is massively huge. That's when I had my "holy shit" moment and realized that this is the technique I'd been waiting for. Instead of asking some closed-ended question with a single correct answer, he'd asked an open-ended, yet calibrated one that forced the other guy to pause and actually think about how to solve the problem. I thought to myself, this is perfect. It's a natural and normal question, not a request for a fact. It's a how question, and how engages because how asks for help. Best of all, he doesn't owe the kidnapper a damn thing. The guy volunteers to put the girlfriend on the phone, he thinks it's his idea. The guy who just offered to put the girlfriend on the line thinks he's in control. And the secret to gaining the upper hand in a negotiation is giving the other side the illusion of control. The genius of this technique is really well explained by something that the psychologist Kevin Dutton says in his book Split-Second Persuasion. Point 1. He talks about what he calls unbelief, which is active resistance to what the other side is saying, complete rejection. That's where the two parties in a negotiation usually start. If you don't ever get off that dynamic, you end up having showdowns, as each side tries to impose its point of view. You get two hard skulls banging against each other, like in Dos Palmas. But if you can get the other side to drop their unbelief, you can slowly work them to your point of view on the back of their energy, just like the drug dealer's question got the kidnapper to volunteer to do what the drug dealer wanted. You don't directly persuade them to see your ideas. Instead, you ride them to your ideas. As the saying goes, the best way to ride a horse is in the direction in which it is going. Our job as persuaders is easier than we think. It's not to get others believing what we say. It's just to stop them unbelieving. Once we achieve that, the game's half won. Unbelief is the friction that keeps persuasion in check, Dutton says. Without it, there'd be no limits. Giving your counterpart the illusion of control by asking calibrated questions, by asking for help, is one of the most powerful tools for suspending unbelief. Not long ago, I read this great article in the New York Times too by a medical student who was faced with a patient who had ripped out his packed his bags, and was making a move to leave because his biopsy results were days late and he was tired of waiting. Just then a senior physician arrived. After calmly offering the patient a glass of water and asking if they could chat for a minute, he said he understood why the patient was pissed off and promised to call the lab to see why the results were delayed. But what he did next is what really suspended the patient's unbelief. He asked a calibrated question, what he felt was so important about leaving, and then when the patient said he had errands to handle, the doctor offered to connect the patient with services that could help him get them done. And, boom, the patient volunteered to stay. What's so powerful about the senior doctor's technique is that he took what was a showdown, I'm going to leave, versus, you can't leave, and asked questions that led the patient to solve his own problem, in the way the doctor wanted. It was still a kind of showdown, of course, but the doctor took the confrontation and bravado out of it by giving the patient the illusion of control. As an old Washington Post editor named Robert Estabrook once said, he who has learned to disagree without being disagreeable has discovered the most valuable secret of negotiation. This same technique for suspending unbelief that you use with kidnappers and escaping patients works for anything, even negotiating prices. When you go into a store, instead of telling the sales clerk what you need, you can describe what you're looking for and ask for suggestions. Then, once you've picked out what you want, instead of hitting them with a hard offer, you can just say the price is a bit more than you budgeted and ask for help with one of the greatest of all time calibrated questions. How am I supposed to do that? The critical part of this approach is that you really are asking for help and your delivery must convey that. With this negotiating scheme, instead of bullying the clerk, you're asking for their advice and giving them the illusion of control. Asking for help in this manner, after you've already been engaged in a dialogue, is an incredibly powerful negotiating technique for transforming encounters from confrontational showdowns into joint problem-solving sessions. And calibrated questions are the best tool. Calibrate your questions. A few years ago, I was consulting with a client who had a small firm that did public relations for a large corporation. The folks at the big company were not paying their bills, and as time went on, they owed my client more and more money. They kept her on the hook by promising lots of repeat business, implying that she would get a pile of revenue if she just kept working. She felt trapped. My advice for her was simple. I told her to engage them in a conversation where she summarized the situation and then asked, "How am I supposed to do that?" She shook her head. No way. The idea of having to ask this question just terrified her. "If they tell me I have to, then I'm trapped," was her reaction. She also heard the question as, "You're screwing me out of money and it has to stop." That sounded like the first step to her getting fired as a consultant. I explained to her that this implication, though real, was in her mind. Her client would hear the words and not the implication as long as she kept calm and avoided making it sound by her delivery like an accusation or threat. As long as she stayed cool, they would hear it as a problem to be solved. She didn't quite believe me. We walked through the script several times, but she was still afraid. Then a few days later she called me, totally giddy with happiness. The client had called with another request and she had finally gotten up the courage to summarize the situation and ask, "How am I supposed to do that?" And you know what? The answer she got was, "You're right, you can't and I apologize." Her client explained that they were going through some internal problems, but she was given a new accounting contact and told she'd be paid within 48 hours. And she was. Now, think about how my client's question worked. Without accusing them of anything, it pushed the big company to understand her problem and offer the solution she wanted. That in a nutshell is the whole point of open-ended questions that are calibrated for a specific effect. Like the softening words and phrases, perhaps, maybe, I think, and it seems, the calibrated open-ended question takes the aggression out of a confrontational statement or close-ended request that might otherwise anger your counterpart. What makes them work is that they are subject to interpretation by your counterpart instead of being rigidly defined. They allow you to introduce ideas and requests without sounding overbearing or pushy. And that's the difference between "you're screwing me out of money" and "it has to stop" and "how am I supposed to do that?" The real beauty of calibrated questions is the fact that they offer no target for attack like statements do. Calibrated questions have the power to educate your counterpart on what the problem is rather than causing conflict by telling them what the problem is. But calibrated questions are not just random requests for comment. They have a direction. Once you figure out where you want a conversation to go, you have to design the questions that will ease the conversation in that direction while letting the other guy think it's his choice to take you there. That's why I refer to these questions as calibrated questions. You have to calibrate them carefully, just like you would calibrate a gun sight or a measuring scale, to target a specific problem. The good news is that there are rules for that. First off, calibrated questions avoid verbs or words like can, is, are, do, or does. These are closed-ended questions that can be answered with a simple yes or a no. Instead, they start with a list of words people know as reporters' questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Those words inspire your counterpart to think and then speak expansively. But let me cut the list even further. It's best to start with what, how, and sometimes why. Nothing else. Who, when, and where will often just get your counterpart to share a fact without thinking. And why can backfire. Regardless of what language the word why is translated into, it's accusatory. There are very rare moments when this is to your advantage. The only time you can use why successfully is when the defensiveness that is created supports the change you are trying to get them to see. Why would you ever change from the way you've always done things and try my approach, is an example. Why would your company ever change from your long-standing vendor and choose our company, is another. As always, tone of voice, respectful and deferential, is critical. Otherwise, treat why like a burner on a hot stove. Don't touch it. Having just 2 words to start with might not seem like a lot of ammunition, but trust me, you can use what and how to calibrate nearly any question. Does this look like something you would like? Can become how does this look to you, or what about this works for you? You can even ask, what about this doesn't work for you? And you'll probably trigger quite a bit of useful information from your counterpart. Even something as harsh as, why did you do it, can be calibrated to, what caused you to do it, which takes away the emotion and makes the question less accusatory. You should use calibrated questions early and often, and there are a few that you will find that you will use in the beginning of nearly every negotiation. What is the biggest challenge you face, is one of those questions. It just gets the other side to teach you something about themselves, which is critical to any negotiation because all negotiation is an information gathering process. Here are some other great standbys that I use in almost every negotiation, depending on the situation. What about this is important to you? How can I help to make this better for us? How would you like me to proceed? What is it that brought us into this situation? How can we solve this problem? What's the objective? / what are we trying to accomplish here? How am I supposed to do that? The implication of any well-designed calibrated question is that you want what the other guy wants, but you need his intelligence to overcome the problem. This really appeals to very aggressive or egotistical counterparts. You've not only implicitly asked for help, triggering goodwill and less defensiveness, but you've engineered a situation in which your formerly recalcitrant counterpart is now using his mental and emotional resources to overcome your challenges. It is the first step in your counterpart internalizing your way, and the obstacles in it, as his own. And that guides the other party toward designing a solution. Your solution. Think back to how the doctor used calibrated questions to get his patient to stay. As his story showed, the key to getting people to see things your way is not to confront them on their ideas, you can't leave, but to acknowledge their ideas openly. I understand why you're pissed off, and then guide them towards solving the problem. What do you hope to accomplish by leaving? Like I said before, the secret to gaining the upper hand in a negotiation is giving the other side the illusion of control. That's why calibrated questions are ingenious. Calibrated questions make your counterpart feel like they're in charge, but it's really you who are framing the conversation. Your counterpart will have no idea how constrained they are by your questions. Once I was negotiating with one of my FBI bosses about attending a Harvard executive program. He had already approved the expenditure for the travel, but on the day before I was supposed to leave he called me into his office and began to question the validity of the trip. I knew him well enough to know that he was trying to show me that he was in charge. So after we talked for a while, I looked at him and asked, when you originally approved this trip, what did you have in mind? He visibly relaxed as he sat back in his chair and brought the top of his fingers and thumbs together in the shape of a steeple. Generally, this is a body language that means the person feels superior and in charge. Listen, he said, just make sure you brief everyone when you get back. That question, calibrated to acknowledge his power and nudge him toward explaining himself, gave him the illusion of control. And it got me just what I wanted. How not to get paid. Let's pause for a minute here, because there's one vitally important thing you have to remember when you enter a negotiation armed with your list of calibrated questions. That is, all of this is great, but there's a rub. Without self-control and emotional regulation, it doesn't work. The very first thing I talk about when I'm training new negotiators is the critical importance of self-control. If you can't control your own emotions, how can you expect to influence the emotions of another party? To show you what I mean, let me tell you a story. Not long ago, a freelance marketing strategist came to me with a problem. One of her clients had hired a new CEO, a penny pincher whose strategy was to cut costs by offshoring everything he could. He was also a male chauvinist who didn't like the assertive style in which the strategist, a woman, conducted herself. Immediately my client and the CEO started to go at each other on conference calls in that passive-aggressive way that is ever present in corporate America. After a few weeks of this, my client decided she'd had enough and invoiced the CEO for the last bit of work she'd done, about $7,000, and politely said that the arrangement wasn't working out. The CEO answered by saying the bill was too high, that he'd pay half of it and that they would talk about the rest. After that, he stopped answering her calls. The underlying dynamic was that this guy didn't like being questioned by anyone, especially a woman. So I developed a strategy that showed him she understood where she went wrong and acknowledged his power, while at the same time directing his energy towards solving her problem. The script we came up with hit all the best practices of negotiation we've talked about so far. Here it is by steps. 1. A no-oriented email question to reinitiate contact. Have you given up on settling this amicably? 2. A statement that leaves only the answer of, that's right, to form a dynamic of agreement. It seems that you feel my bill is not justified. 3. Calibrated questions about the problem to get him to reveal his thinking. How does this bill violate our agreement? 4. More no-oriented questions to remove unspoken barriers. Are you saying I misled you? Are you saying I didn't do as you asked? Are you saying I reneged on our agreement? Or, are you saying I failed you? 5. Labeling and mirroring the essence of his answers if they are not acceptable so he has to consider them again. It seems like you feel my work was subpar. Or, my work was subpar. 6. A calibrated question in reply to any offer other than full payment, in order to get him to offer a solution. How am I supposed to accept that? 7. If none of this gets an offer of full payment, a label that flatters his sense of control and power. It seems like you are the type of person who prides himself on the way he does business, rightfully so, and has a knack for not only expanding the pie but making the ship run more efficiently. 8. A long pause and then one more no-oriented question. Do you want to be known as someone who doesn't fulfill agreements? From my long experience in negotiation, scripts like this have a 90% success rate. That is, if the negotiator stays calm and rational. And that's a big if. In this case, she didn't. The first step, the magic email, worked better than she imagined, and the CEO called within 10 minutes, surprising her. Almost immediately her anger flared at the sound of his patronizing voice. Her only desire became to show him how he was wrong, to impose her will, and the conversation became a showdown that went nowhere. You probably don't need me to tell you that she didn't even get half. With that in mind, I want to end this chapter with some advice on how to remain rational in a negotiation. Even with all the best techniques and strategy, you need to regulate your emotions if you want to have any hope of coming out on top. The first and most basic rule of keeping your emotional cool is to bite your tongue. Not literally, of course. But you have to keep away from knee-jerk, passionate reactions. Pause. Think. Let the passion dissipate. That allows you to collect your thoughts and be more circumspect in what you say. It also lowers your chance of saying more than you want to. The Japanese have this figured out. When negotiating with a foreigner, it's common practice for a Japanese businessman to use a translator even when he understands perfectly what the other side is saying. That's because speaking through a translator forces him to step back. It gives him time to frame his response. Another simple rule is, when you are verbally assaulted, do not counterattack. Instead, disarm your counterpart by asking a calibrated question. The next time a waiter or sales clerk tries to engage you in a verbal skirmish, try this out. I promise you it will change the entire tenor of the conversation. The basic issue here is that when people feel that they are not in control, they adopt what psychologists call a hostage mentality. That is, in moments of conflict they react to their lack of power by either becoming extremely defensive or lashing out. Neurologically, in situations like this the fight-or-flight mechanism in the reptilian brain or the emotions in the limbic system overwhelm the rational part of our mind, the neocortex, leading us to overreact in an impulsive, instinctive way. In a negotiation, like in the one between my client and the CEO, this always produces a negative outcome. So we have to train our neocortex to override the emotions from the other two brains. That means biting your tongue and learning how to mindfully change your state to something more positive. And it means lowering the hostage mentality in your counterpart by asking a question or even offering an apology. You're right. That was a bit harsh. If you were able to take an armed kidnapper who'd been surrounded by police and hook him up to a cardiac monitor, you'd find that every calibrated question and apology would lower his heart rate just a little bit. And that's how you get to a dynamic where solutions can be found. Key lessons. Who has control in a conversation, the guy listening or the guy talking? The listener, of course. That's because the talker is revealing information while the listener, if he's trained well, is directing the conversation toward his own goals. He's harnessing the talker's energy for his own ends. When you try to work the skills from this chapter into your daily life, remember that these are listeners' tools. They are not about strong-arming your opponent into submission. Rather, they're about using the counterpart's power to get to your objective. They're listeners' judo. As you put listeners' judo into practice, remember the following powerful lessons. Don't try to force your opponent to admit that you are right. Aggressive confrontation is the enemy of constructive negotiation. Avoid questions that can be answered with yes or tiny pieces of information. These require little thought and inspire the human need for reciprocity. You will be expected to give something back. Ask calibrated questions that start with the words how or what. By implicitly asking the other party for help, these questions will give your counterpart an illusion of control and will inspire them to speak at length, revealing important information. Don't ask questions that start with why unless you want your counterpart to defend a goal that serves you. Why is always an accusation in any language. Calibrate your questions to point your counterpart towards solving your problem. This will encourage them to expend their energy on devising a solution. Bite your tongue. When you're attacked in a negotiation, pause and avoid angry emotional reactions. Instead, ask your counterpart a calibrated question. There is always a team on the other side. If you are not influencing those behind the table, you are vulnerable. Chapter 8. Guarantee execution. During a dangerous and chaotic prison siege in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, a few years ago, a group of inmates armed with makeshift knives took the warden and some of his staff hostage. The situation was especially nervy because the prisoners were both tense and disorganized, a worrisome mix that meant anything could happen. The negotiators sensed that, beneath the bluster, the prisoners didn't really want to hurt the staff. They knew that they felt backed into a corner and, more than anything, they wanted the situation to end. But there was a stumbling block. The inmates were afraid that the prisoners who gave up after taking correctional officers hostage, not to mention the warden, would end up beaten, and badly. So the negotiators delivered a pair of walkie-talkies to the inmates and designed this elaborate surrender ritual to get the hostage-takers to end the siege. The idea was elegantly simple. The inmates would send out one of their guys with a walkie-talkie, and he'd walk past the 3 perimeters of combined multi-agency law enforcement that were stationed outside the prison. Once he'd walked past the final perimeter, he'd get into the paddy wagon and be transferred to jail. There, he'd use the walkie-talkie to call the guys back in the prison and say, essentially, they didn't kick my ass. And they'd know it was okay to come out just like he did, one at a time. After some haggling, the inmates agreed with the plan and the first inmate comes out. It starts off great. He walks past the federal zone, then the SWAT zone, and then he makes it to the outer perimeter. But just as he's about to climb into the paddy wagon, some guy sees the walkie-talkie and says, "What the hell are you doing with that?" and confiscates it before sending the guy off to the jail. The inmates back in the prison start to freak out because their buddy hasn't called. The one with the other walkie-talkie calls the negotiators and starts yelling, "Why didn't he call?" They're kicking his ass. We told you. He starts talking about cutting off a hostage's finger, just to make sure the negotiators know the inmates are for real. Now it's the negotiators who are freaking out. They sprint to the perimeter and start screaming at everyone. It's life and death at stake. Or at least an amputated finger. Finally, 15 nail-biting minutes later, this SWAT guy comes striding up, all proud of himself. Some idiot gave this dude a radio, he says, and sort of smiles as he hands the negotiators the walkie-talkie. The negotiators barely stop themselves from slugging the guy before they tear off to the jail to have the first inmate call in. Crisis averted, but barely. The point here is that your job as a negotiator isn't just to get to an agreement. It's getting to one that can be implemented and making sure that happens. Negotiators have to be decision architects. They have to dynamically and adaptively design the verbal and nonverbal elements of the negotiation to gain both consent and execution. Yes is nothing without how. While an agreement is nice, a contract is better, and a signed check is best. You don't get your profits with the agreement. They come upon implementation. Success isn't the hostage taker saying, "Yes, we have a deal." Success comes afterward, when the freed hostage says to your face, "Thank you." In this chapter, I'll show how to drive toward and achieve consent, both with those at the negotiating table and with the invisible forces underneath it, distinguish true buy-in from fake acquiescence, and guarantee execution using the rule of 3. Yes is nothing without how. About a year after the Dos Palmas crisis, I was teaching at the FBI Academy in Quantico when the Bureau got an urgent call from the State Department. An American had been kidnapped in the Ecuadorian jungle by a Colombia-based rebel group. As the FBI's lead international hostage negotiator, this was my baby, so I put a team together and set up Operation Headquarters in Quantico. For a few years, Jose and his wife, Julie, had been guiding tour groups through the jungle near the Colombian border. Born in Ecuador, Jose had become an American citizen and was working as a paramedic in New York City when he and Julie decided to set up an ecotourism business in his native country. Jose loved the Ecuadorian jungle, and he'd long dreamed of teaching visitors about the monkeys that swung through the trees and the flowers that perfumed the trails. The business grew as ecotourists fell for the pair's obvious passion, and on August 20, 2003, Jose and Julie took 11 people on a whitewater rafting trip down the Mira River. After a great day on the water, everyone was smiling and soaked as they piled into jeeps and pickups for the ride to an inn in a nearby village. Jose told tall tales as he drove the lead truck, Julie to his right with their 11-month-old baby in her lap. They were 5 minutes from the inn when 3 men jumped into the road and aimed guns at the truck. A 4th man emerged and held a revolver to Julie's head as the thugs pulled Jose from the car and forced him into the truck bed. The kidnappers then ordered the caravan through several small towns to a fork in the road, where they got out and walked Jose past Julie's seat in the cab. "Just remember," Julie said, "no matter what happens, I love you. Don't worry." "I'll be fine," Jose answered. And then he and his captors disappeared into the jungle. The captors wanted $5 million. We wanted to buy time. Ever since the Dos Palmas debacle and the Pittsburgh Epiphany, I had been raring to employ the lessons we'd learned about calibrated questions. So when Jose was kidnapped, I sent my guys down to Ecuador and told them that we had a new strategy. The kidnapping would provide an opportunity to prove this approach. All we're going to say is, "Hey, how do we know Jose is okay? How are we supposed to pay until we know Jose is okay?" Again and again, I told them. Although they were queasy about untested techniques, my guys were game. The local cops were livid, though, because they always did proof of life the old-fashioned way, which the FBI had taught them in the first place. Luckily, Julie was with us 100% because she saw how the calibrated questions would stall for time, and she was convinced that with enough time her husband would find a way to get home. The day after the kidnapping, the rebels marched Jose into the mountains along the Colombian border and settled in a cabin high in the jungle. There Jose built a rapport with the kidnappers to make himself harder for them to kill. He impressed them with his knowledge of the jungle and, with a black belt in karate, he filled the time by teaching them martial arts. My negotiators coached Julie every day as we waited for contact from the rebels. We learned later that the designated negotiator from Jose's captors had to walk to town to negotiate by phone. My guys told Julie to answer every one of the kidnappers' demands with a question. My strategy was to keep the kidnappers engaged but off balance. "How do I know Jose is alive?" she asked the first time they talked. To their demand for $5 million, she said, "We don't have that kind of money." "How can we raise that much? How can we pay you anything until we know Jose is okay?" Julie asked the next time they talked. Questions, always questions. The kidnapper who was negotiating with Julie seemed extremely perplexed by her persistent questions, and he kept asking for time to think. That slowed everything down, but he never got angry with Julie. Answering questions gave him the illusion that he had control of the negotiation. By constantly asking questions and making minuscule offers, Julie drove the ransom down to $16,500. When they came to that number, the kidnappers demanded she get it to them immediately. "How can I do that when I have to sell my cars and trucks?" she asked. Always buying more time. We were starting to grin because success was within reach. We were really close to a ransom that the family could afford. And then I got a phone call in the middle of the night from one of my deployed guys in Ecuador, Kevin Rust. Kevin is a terrific negotiator and the same guy who'd called to tell me a year earlier that Martin Burnham had been killed. My stomach tied into a knot when I heard his voice. "We just got a call from Jose," Kevin said. "He's still in guerrilla territory, but he escaped and he's on a bus and he's making his way out." It took me half a minute to respond, and when I did all I could say was, "Holy shit. That's fantastic news." What had happened, we learned later, was that with all the delays and questions, some of the guerrillas peeled off and didn't return. Pretty soon there was only one teenager guarding Jose at night. He saw an opening late one evening when it began to chuck down rain. Pounding on the metal roof, the rain drowned out all other sound as the lone guard slept. Knowing the wet leaves outside would absorb the sound of his footsteps, Jose climbed through the window, ran down jungle paths to a dirt road, and worked his way to a small town. 2 days later he was back with Julie and their baby, just a few days before his daughter's first birthday. Julie was right, with enough time he had found a way home. Calibrated, how questions are a surefire way to keep negotiations going. They put the pressure on your counterpart to come up with answers, and to contemplate your problems when making their demands. With enough of the right, how questions you can read and shape the negotiating environment in such a way that you'll eventually get to the answer you want to hear. You just have to have an idea of where you want the conversation to go when you're devising your questions. The trick to how questions is that, correctly used, they are gentle and graceful ways to say no and guide your counterpart to develop a better solution, your solution. A gentle how/no invites collaboration and leaves your counterpart with a feeling of having been treated with respect. Look back at what Julie did when the Colombian rebel kidnappers made their first demands. "How can we raise that much?" she asked. Notice that she did not use the word no, but she still managed to elegantly deny the kidnappers' $5 million demand. As Julie did, the first and most common no question you'll use is some version of, "How am I supposed to do that?" For example, "How can we raise that much?" Your tone of voice is critical as this phrase can be delivered as either an accusation or a request for assistance. So pay attention to your voice. This question tends to have the positive effect of making the other side take a good look at your situation. This positive dynamic is what I refer to as forced empathy, and it's especially effective if leading up to it you've already been empathic with your counterpart. This engages the dynamic of reciprocity to lead them to do something for you. Starting with Jose's kidnapping, "How am I supposed to do that?" became our primary response to a kidnapper demanding a ransom. And we never had it backfire. Once I was working with an accounting consultant named Kelly who was owed a pile of money by a corporate client. She kept consulting because she believed she was developing a useful contact, and because the promise of a future payday seemed to justify continuing in good faith. But at a certain point Kelly was so far behind on her own bills that she was in a bind. She couldn't continue to work with only a vague idea of when she'd get paid, but she worried that if she pushed too hard she wouldn't get paid at all. I told her to wait until the client asked for more work, because if she made a firm payment demand right away she would be vulnerable if they refused. Luckily for Kelly, the client soon called to ask her for more work. Once he finished his request, she calmly asked a "how" question. "I'd love to help," she said, "but how am I supposed to do that?" By indicating her willingness to work but asking for help finding a way to do so, she left her deadbeat customer with no choice but to put her needs ahead of everything else. And she got paid. Besides saying no, the other key benefit of asking "how" is, quite literally, that it forces your counterpart to consider and explain how a deal will be implemented. A deal is nothing without good implementation. Poor implementation is the cancer that eats your profits. By making your counterparts articulate implementation in their own words, your carefully calibrated "how" questions will convince them that the final solution is their idea. And that's crucial. People always make more effort to implement a solution when they think it's theirs. That is simply human nature. That's why negotiation is often called the art of letting someone else have your way. There are two key questions you can ask to push your counterparts to think they are defining success their way. How will we know we're on track? And how will we address things if we find we're off track? When they answer, you summarize their answers until you get a "that's right." Then you'll know they've bought in. On the flip side, be wary of two telling signs that your counterpart doesn't believe the idea is theirs. As I've noted, when they say, "you're right," it's often a good indicator they are not vested in what is being discussed. And when you push for implementation and they say, "I'll try," you should get a sinking feeling in your stomach. Because this really means, "I plan to fail." When you hear either of these, dive back in with calibrated "how" questions until they define the terms of successful implementation in their own voice. Follow up by summarizing what they have said to get a "that's right." Let the other side feel victory. Let them think it was their idea. Subsume your ego. Remember, yes is nothing without how. So keep asking how. And succeed. Influencing those behind the table. A few weeks after Jose got back to the United States, I drove to his family's place in upstate New York. I was thrilled when Jose escaped, but the case left me with one nagging worry: had my new strategy failed? You see, Jose had gotten home safely, but not because we'd negotiated his release. I worried that our winning had less to do with our brilliant strategy than with dumb luck. After being greeted warmly by Julie and her parents, Jose and I grabbed some coffee and sat down. I'd gone there to do what CNU referred to as a hostage survival debriefing. I was after insights into how to better advise people facing potential kidnappings how best to survive, not just physically, but psychologically. I was also burning to find out what had occurred behind the scenes because it seemed as if my new strategy hadn't worked. Finally, the conversation came around to our use of calibrated questions. "You know what?" he said. The craziest thing was that their negotiator was supposed to stay in town and negotiate the deal, but because Julie kept asking him questions he didn't really know for sure how to answer, he kept coming out to the jungle. They all would get together and have a huge discussion about how to respond. They even thought about taking me into town and putting me on the phone because Julie was so persistent with asking how did she know if I was okay. Right then I knew we had the right tool. It was exactly the opposite of the Burnham case, where our negotiator cut the deal with one of the guys and then the rest of them took the $300,000 and said, "No, we're not doing that." Causing the other side to work that hard and forcing that much internal coordination in service of our own goals was unprecedented. Our negotiating strategy in Ecuador worked not just because the questions contributed to the environment that let Jose escape, but because they made sure the kidnappers, our counterparts, were all on the same page. Yes, few hostage takers, and few business deal makers, fly solo. But for the most part, there are almost always other players, people who can act as deal makers or deal killers. If you truly want to get to yes and get your deal implemented, you have to discover how to affect these individuals. When implementation happens by committee, the support of that committee is key. You always have to identify and unearth their motivations, even if you haven't yet identified each individual on that committee. That can be easy as asking a few calibrated questions, like, how does this affect the rest of your team, or how on board are the people not on this call, or simply, what do your colleagues see as their main challenges in this area? The larger concept I'm explaining here is that in any negotiation you have to analyze the entire negotiation space. When other people will be affected by what is negotiated and can assert their rights or power later on, it's just stupid to consider only the interests of those at the negotiation table. You have to beware of behind the table or level 2 players, that is, parties that are not directly involved but who can help implement agreements they like and block ones they don't. You can't disregard them even when you're talking to a CEO. There could always be someone whispering into his ear. At the end of the day, the deal killers often are more important than the deal makers. Think back to the prison siege. It was almost ruined because one bit player on our side was not totally on board. That's what our use of calibrated questions in Ecuador avoided, and that's why Jose's case was a home run. It only takes one bit player to screw up a deal. A few years into private practice I'd lost sight of the importance of assessing and influencing the hidden negotiation that happens behind the table, and I paid a substantial price. We were closing a deal with a big company in Florida that wanted negotiation training for one of its divisions. We'd been on the phone a bunch of times with the CEO and the head of HR, and they were both 100% gung-ho on our offering. We were elated. We had what we thought was total buy-in from the top decision makers for an incredibly lucrative deal. And then, as we were figuring out the small print, the deal fell off the table. It turns out that the head of the division that needed the training killed the deal. Maybe this guy felt threatened, slighted, or otherwise somehow personally injured by the notion that he and his people needed any training at all. A surprisingly high percentage of negotiations hinge on something outside dollars and cents, often having more to do with self-esteem, status, and other non-financial needs. We'll never know now. The point is, we didn't care until too late because we convinced ourselves that we were on the phone with the only decision makers that mattered. We could have avoided all that had we asked a few calibrated questions, like, how does this affect everybody else? How on board is the rest of your team? How do we make sure that we deliver the right material to the right people? How do we ensure the managers of those we're training are fully on board? If we had asked questions like that, the CEO and HR head would have checked with this guy, maybe even brought him into the conversation. And saved us all a lot of pain. Spotting liars, dealing with jerks, and charming everyone else. As a negotiator, you're going to run into guys who lie to your face and try to scare you into agreement. Aggressive jerks and serial fabricators come with the territory, and dealing with them is something you have to do. But learning how to handle aggression and identify falsehood is just part of a larger issue. That is, learning how to spot and interpret the subtleties of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, that reveal the mental states of your counterparts. Truly effective negotiators are conscious of the verbal, paraverbal, how it's said, and nonverbal communications that pervade negotiations and group dynamics. And they know how to employ those subtleties to their benefit. Even changing a single word when you present options, like using not lose instead of keep, can unconsciously influence the conscious choices your counterpart makes. Here I want to talk about the tools you need to ID liars, disarm jerks, and charm everybody else. Of course, the open-ended how question is one of them, maybe the most important one, but there are many more. Alistair Onglingswan was living in the Philippines when, one evening in 2004, he hailed a taxi and settled in for a long ride home from Manila's Green Hills shopping center. He dozed off. And he woke up in chains. Unfortunately for Alistair, the cabbie had a second business as a kidnapper. He kept a bottle of ether in his front seat, and when a target fell asleep he would drug him, imprison him, and ask for ransom. Within hours, the kidnapper used Alistair's phone to contact his girlfriend in New York. He demanded a daily payment to take care of Alistair while he researched the family's wealth. "It's okay if you don't pay," he said. "I can always sell his organs in Saudi Arabia." Within 24 hours, I'd been charged with heading the negotiation from Quantico. Alistair's girlfriend was too nervous to handle the family side of the negotiation, and his mother, who lived in the Philippines, just wanted to accept any demand the kidnapper made. But Alistair's brother Aaron, in Manila, was different. He just got the idea of negotiation and he accepted that Alistair might die, which would make him a better and more effective negotiator. Aaron and I set up an always-on phone line and I became Aaron's guru on the other side of the world. Through the kidnapper's comments and demands, I saw that he was experienced and patient. As a token of his intentions, he offered to cut off one of Alistair's ears and send it to the family along with a video of him severing the ear. The demand for the daily payment was clearly a trick to quickly drain the family of as much money as possible while at the same time gauging their wealth. We had to figure out who this guy was. Was he a lone operator or part of a group? Did he plan on killing Alistair or not? And we had to do that before the family went broke. To get there, we were going to have to engage the kidnapper in a protracted negotiation. We were going to have to slow everything down. From Quantico, I loaded Aaron up with calibrated questions. I instructed him to keep peppering the violent jerk with how. How am I supposed to? How do we know? How can we? There is great power in treating jerks with deference. It gives you the ability to be extremely assertive, to say no, in a hidden fashion. How do we know if we pay you that you won't hurt Alistair? Aaron asked. In the Chinese martial art of Tai Chi, the goal is to use your opponent's aggressiveness against him, to turn his offense into your way to defeat him. That's the approach we took with Alistair's kidnapper. We wanted to absorb his threats and wear him down. We made sure that even scheduling a call with us was complex. We delayed making email responses. Through all these tactics, we gained the upper hand while giving the kidnapper the illusion of control. He thought he was solving Aaron's problems while we were just reading him and wasting his time. You see, it's best not to go chin to chin with aggressiveness like that of Alistair's kidnapper. Rather, default to using what and how questions to avoid making bids or adjusting your own negotiating position. Dodge and weave. Finally, following days of back-and-forth bargaining on the daily rate, Aaron got the kidnapper down to a token amount and agreed to deposit a portion of the funds in his bank account. After that partial payment was made, Aaron came up with the perfect way to non-confrontationally confront the cabbie with a calibrated when/what question. When we run out of money, what will happen? Aaron asked. The kidnapper paused. "It will be all right," he finally responded. "Yes." Without realizing what he had just agreed to, our killer had just promised us he wouldn't hurt Alistair. A repetitive series of what and how questions can help you overcome the aggressive tactics of a manipulative adversary. As you can see in that last exchange, the kidnapper's protracted chats with Aaron had turned Aaron almost into a friend. Over time, the kidnapper had become unguarded about spending time on the phone with his friend. Finally, the Philippine National Police investigators tracked the phone to a house and raided it. The kidnapper and Alistair were not there, but the kidnapper's wife was. She told the police about another house they owned. The police quickly raided the other house, freed Alistair, and arrested the kidnapper. There are plenty of other tactics, tools, and methods for using subtle verbal and nonverbal forms of communication to understand and modify the mental states of your counterpart. As I run through some of them here, I want you to take a moment to internalize each one. These are the kind of tools that can help observant negotiators hit home runs. The 7-38-55% rule. In two famous studies on what makes us like or dislike somebody, one UCLA psychology professor Albert Mehrabian created the 7-38-55 rule. That is, only 7% of a message is based on the words, while 38% comes from the tone of voice and 55% from the speaker's body language and face. While these figures mainly relate to situations where we are forming an attitude about somebody, the rule nonetheless offers a useful ratio for negotiators. You see, body language and tone of voice, not words, are our most powerful assessment tools. That's why I'll often fly great distances to meet someone face to face, even when I can say much of what needs to be said over the phone. So how do you use this rule? First, pay very close attention to tone and body language to make sure they match up with the literal meaning of the words. If they don't align, it's quite possible that the speaker is lying or at least unconvinced. When someone's tone of voice or body language does not align with the meaning of the words they say, use labels to discover the source of the incongruence. Here's an example. You, so we're agreed. Them, yes. You, I heard you say, yes, but it seemed like there was hesitation in your voice. Them, oh, it's nothing really. You, no, this is important, let's make sure we get this right. Them, thanks, I appreciate it. This is the way to make sure your agreement gets implemented with no surprises. And your counterpart will be grateful. Your act of recognizing the incongruence and gently dealing with it through a label will make them feel respected. Consequently, your relationship of trust will be improved. The rule of 3. I'm positive that sometime in your life you've been involved in a negotiation where you got a yes that later turned out to be a no. Maybe the other party was lying to you, or maybe they were just engaged in wishful thinking. Either way, this is not an uncommon experience. This happens because there are actually 3 kinds of yes: commitment, confirmation, and counterfeit. As we discussed in Chapter 5, so many pushy salesmen try to trap their clients into the commitment yes that many people get very good at the counterfeit yes. One great tool for avoiding this trap is the rule of 3. The rule of 3 is simply getting the other guy to agree to the same thing 3 times in the same conversation. It's tripling the strength of whatever dynamic you're trying to drill into at the moment. In doing so, it uncovers problems before they happen. It's really hard to repeatedly lie or fake conviction. When I first learned this skill, my biggest fear was how to avoid sounding like a broken record or coming off as really pushy. The answer, I learned, is to vary your tactics. The first time they agree to something or give you a commitment, that's number 1. For number 2, you might label or summarize what they said so they answer, that's right. And number 3 could be a calibrated how or what question about implementation that asks them to explain what will constitute success, something like, "What do we do if we get off track?" Or the 3 times might just be the same calibrated question phrased 3 different ways, like, "What's the biggest challenge you faced? What are we up against here? What do you see as being the most difficult thing to get around?" Either way, going at the same issue 3 times uncovers falsehoods as well as the incongruences between words and body language we mentioned in the last section. So next time you're not sure your counterpart is truthful and committed, try it. The Pinocchio effect. With Carlo Collodi's famous character Pinocchio, it was easy to tell when he was lying, you just had to watch the nose. It turns out that Collodi wasn't far off reality. Most people offer obvious telltale signs when they're lying. Not a growing nose, but close enough. In a study of the components of lying, 2 Harvard Business School professor Deepak Malhotra and his co-authors found that, on average, liars use more words than truth tellers and use far more third-person pronouns. They start talking about him, her, it, one, they, and their rather than I, in order to put some distance between themselves and the lie. And they discovered that liars tend to speak in more complex sentences in an attempt to win over their suspicious counterparts. It's what W.C. Fields meant when he talked about baffling someone with bullshit. The researchers dubbed this the Pinocchio effect because, just like Pinocchio's nose, the number of words grew along with the lie. People who are lying are, understandably, more worried about being believed, so they work harder, too hard, as it were, at being believable. Pay attention to their usage of pronouns. The use of pronouns by a counterpart can also help give you a feel for their actual importance in the decision and implementation chains on the other side of the table. The more in love they are with I, me, and my, the less important they are. Conversely, the harder it is to get a first-person pronoun out of a negotiator's mouth, the more important they are. Just like in the Malhotra study where the liar is distancing himself from the lie, in a negotiation, smart decision-makers don't want to be cornered at the table into making a decision. They will defer to the people away from the table to keep from getting pinned down. Our cab driver kidnapper in the Philippines of Alistair Onglingswan used we, they, and them so rigorously early on in the kidnapping I was convinced we were engaged with their leader. I just never knew how literally true it was until the rescue. In the Chase Manhattan bank robbery from Chapter 2, the bank robber Chris Watts consistently talked out how dangerous the others were and how little influence he had on them, all a lie. The Chris discount. People always talk about remembering and using, but not overusing, your counterpart's name in a negotiation. And that's important. The reality though is people are often tired of being hammered with their own name. The slick salesman trying to drive them to yes will hit them with it over and over. Instead, take a different tack and use your own name. That's how I get the Chris discount. Just as using Alistair's name with the kidnapper and getting him to use it back humanized the hostage and made it less likely he would be harmed, using your own name creates the dynamic of forced empathy. It makes the other side see you as a person. A few years ago I was in a bar in Kansas with a bunch of fellow FBI negotiators. The bar was packed, but I saw one empty chair. I moved toward it, but just as I got ready to sit, the guy next to it said, "Don't even think about it." "Why?" I asked, and he said, "Because I'll kick your ass." He was big, burly, and already drunk, but look, I'm a lifelong hostage negotiator. I gravitate toward tense situations that need mediation like a moth to the flame. I held out my hand to shake his and said, "My name is Chris." The dude froze, and in the pause my fellow FBI guys moved in, patted him on the shoulders, and offered to buy him a drink. Turned out he was a Vietnam veteran at a particularly low point. He was in a packed bar where the entire world seemed to be celebrating. The only thing he could think of was to fight. But as soon as I became Chris, everything changed. Now take that mindset to a financial negotiation. I was in an outlet mall a few months after the Kansas experience and I picked out some shirts in one of the stores. At the front counter, the young lady asked me if I wanted to join their frequent buyer program. I asked her if I got a discount for joining and she said, no. So I decided to try another angle. I said in a friendly manner, my name is Chris. What's the Chris discount? She looked from the register, met my eyes, and gave a little laugh. I'll have to ask my manager, Kathy, she said and turned to the woman who'd been standing next to her. Kathy, who'd heard the whole exchange, said, the best I can do is 10%. Humanize yourself. Use your name to introduce yourself. Say it in a fun, friendly way. Let them enjoy the interaction, too. And get your own special price. How to get your counterparts to bid against themselves. Like you saw Aaron and Julie do with their kidnappers, the best way to get your counterparts to lower their demands is to say no, using how questions. These indirect ways of saying no won't shut down your counterpart the way a blunt, pride-piercing no would. In fact, these responses will sound so much like counterbids that your counterparts will often keep bidding against themselves. We've found that you can usually express no 4 times before actually saying the word. The first step in the no series is the old standby. How am I supposed to do that? You have to deliver it in a deferential way, so it becomes a request for help. Properly delivered, it invites the other side to participate in your dilemma and solve it with a better offer. After that, some version of, your offer is very generous, I'm sorry, that just doesn't work for me, is an elegant second way to say no. This well-tested response avoids making a counteroffer, and the use of a generous nurtures your counterpart to live up to the word. The I'm sorry also softens the no and builds empathy. You can ignore the so-called negotiating experts who say apologies are always signs of weakness. Then you can use something like, I'm sorry but I'm afraid I just can't do that. It's a little more direct, and the can't do that does great double duty. By expressing an inability to perform, it can trigger the other side's empathy toward you. I'm sorry, no, is a slightly more succinct version for the fourth no. If delivered gently, it barely sounds negative at all. If you have to go further, of course, no is the last and most direct way. Verbally, it should be delivered with a downward inflection and a tone of regard. It's not meant to be a no. One of my students, a guy named Jesus Bueno, wrote me not long ago to tell me an amazing story about how he'd used the multi-step no to help his brother Joaquin out of a sticky business situation. His brother and 2 friends had bought a cannabis grow shop franchise in northern Spain, where the cultivation of marijuana for personal use is legal. Joaquin and his partner, Bruno, each invested €20,000 in the business for a 46% stake. A minority partner invested another €3,500 for 8%. From the beginning, Joaquin and Bruno had a rocky relationship. Joaquin is an excellent salesman, while Bruno was more of a bookkeeper. The minority partner was also an excellent salesman, and he and Joaquin believed that growing sales was the correct strategy. That meant offering discounts for large orders and repeat customers, which Bruno disagreed with. Their planned spending on launching a website and expanding inventory also rubbed Bruno the wrong way. Then Bruno's wife became a problem as she started nagging Joaquin about how he should not spend so much on expansion and instead take more profits. One day, Joaquin was reviewing inventory purchases and noticed that some items they had ordered had not been placed on the store's shelves. He began searching for them online and to his surprise he found an eBay store set up with the wife's first name that was selling exactly those missing products. This started a huge argument between Bruno and Joaquin, and soured their relationship. In the heat of the moment, Bruno told Joaquin that he was open to selling his shares because he felt the business risks they were taking were too large. So Joaquin consulted with his brother, my student Jesus. Because they believed that pressure from Bruno's wife was why he wanted to sell, Jesus helped Joaquin craft an empathy message around that. It seems like you are under a lot of pressure from your wife. Joaquin was also in the middle of a divorce, so they decided to use that to relate to the wife issues, and they prepared an accusation audit. I know you think I don't care about costs and taking profits from the company, in order to diffuse the negative energy and get Bruno talking. It worked like a charm. Bruno immediately agreed with the accusation audit and began explaining why he thought Joaquin was careless with spending. Bruno also noted that he didn't have someone to bail him out like Joaquin did. Joaquin got a startup loan from his mother. Joaquin used mirrors to keep Bruno talking, and he did. Finally, Joaquin said, I know how the pressure from your wife can feel. I'm going through a divorce myself and it really takes a lot out of you. Bruno then went on a 10-minute rant about his wife and let slip a huge piece of information. The wife was very upset because the bank that lent them the 20,000 euros had reviewed their loan and had given them two options: repay the loan in full, or pay a much higher interest rate. Bingo! Joaquin and Jesus huddled after learning that, and decided that Joaquin could reasonably pay just above the loan price because Bruno had already taken 14,000 euros in salary from the business. The letter from the bank put Bruno in a bad spot, and Joaquin figured he could bid low because there wasn't really a market for Bruno to sell his shares. They decided that 23,000 euros would be the magic number, with 11,000 euros up front with the remaining 12,000 euro over a year period. Then things went sideways. Instead of waiting for Bruno to name a price, Joaquin jumped the gun and made his full offer, telling Bruno that he thought it was very fair. If there's one way to put off your counterpart, it's by implying that disagreeing with you is unfair. What happened next proved that. Bruno angrily hung up the phone, and 2 days later Joaquin received an email from a guy saying he'd been hired to represent Bruno. They wanted 30,812 euros, 20,000 euros for the loan, 4,000 euros for salary, 6,230 euros for equity, and 582 euros for interest. Non-round figures that seemed unchangeable in their specificity. This guy was a pro. Jesus told Joaquin that he'd truly screwed up. But they both knew that Bruno was pretty desperate to sell. So they decided to use the multi-step no strategy to get Bruno to bid against himself. The worst-case scenario, they decided, was that Bruno would just change his mind about selling his shares and the status quo would continue. It was a risk they'd have to take. They crafted their first no message. The price you offered is very fair, and I certainly wish that I could afford it. Bruno has worked very hard for this business, and he deserves to be compensated appropriately. I am very sorry, but wish you the best of luck. Notice how they made no counteroffer and said no without using the word. Joaquin was shocked, and the following day he received an email from the advisor lowering the price to 28,346 euros. Joaquin and Jesus then crafted their second gentle no. Thank you for your offer. You were generous to reduce the price, which I greatly appreciate. I really wish that I could pay you this amount, but I am sincere in that I cannot afford this amount at this time. As you know, I am in the middle of a divorce and I just cannot come up with that type of money. Again, I wish you the best of luck. The next day Joaquin received a one-line email from the advisor dropping the price to 25,000 euros. Joaquin wanted to take it, but Jesus told him that he had some no steps to go. Joaquin fought him, but in the end he relented. There's a critical lesson there. The art of closing a deal is staying focused to the very end. There are crucial points at the finale when you must draw on your mental discipline. Don't think about what time the last flight leaves, or what it would be like to get home early and play golf. Do not let your mind wander. Remain focused. They wrote. Thank you again for the generous offer. You have really come down on the price and I have tried very hard to come up with that amount. Unfortunately, no one is willing to lend me the money, not even my mother. I have tried various avenues but cannot come up with the funding. In the end, I can offer you 23,567 euros, although I can only pay 15,321 euros and 37 cents upfront. I could pay you the remainder over a 1-year period, but that is really the most I can do. I wish you the best in your decision. Brilliant use of specific numbers, and what an empathy-building way to say no without using the word. And it worked. Within 1 hour, the advisor responded to accept. Look at this closely. See how the mixture of mirroring and open-ended questions dragged out the information about Bruno's financial problems, and then the no method exploited his desperation. It might not have been a great idea to use this method if there'd been another buyer, but with no one else it was a brilliant way to get Bruno to bid against himself. Key lessons. Superstar negotiators, real rainmakers, know that a negotiation is a playing field beneath the words, where really getting to a good deal involves detecting and manipulating subtle, non-obvious signals beneath the surface. It is only by visualizing and modifying these subsurface issues that you can craft a great deal and make sure that it is implemented. As you put the following tools to use, remember this chapter's most important concept. That is, yes is nothing without how. Asking how, knowing how, and defining how are all part of the effective negotiator's arsenal. He would be unarmed without them. Ask calibrated how questions, and ask them again and again. Asking how keeps your counterparts engaged but off balance. Answering the questions will give them the illusion of control. It will also lead them to contemplate your problems when making their demands. Use how questions to shape the negotiating environment. You do this by using how can I do that as a gentle version of no. This will subtly push your counterpart to search for other solutions, your solutions. And very often it will get them to bid against themselves. Don't just pay attention to the people you're negotiating with directly, always identify the motivations of the players behind the table. You can do so by asking how a deal will affect everybody else and how on board they are. Follow the 7-38-55% rule by paying close attention to tone of voice and body language. Incongruence between the words and nonverbal signs will show when your counterpart is lying or uncomfortable with a deal. Is the yes real or counterfeit? Test it with the rule of 3. Use calibrated questions, summaries, and labels to get your counterpart to reaffirm their agreement at least 3 times. It's really hard to repeatedly lie or fake conviction. A person's use of pronouns offers deep insights into his or her relative authority. If you're hearing a lot of I, me, and my, the real power to decide probably lies elsewhere. Picking up a lot of we, they, and them, it's more likely you're dealing directly with a savvy decision maker keeping his options open. Use your own name to make yourself a real person to the other side and even get your own personal discount. Humor and humanity are the best ways to break the ice and remove roadblocks. Thank you for joining this journey through Never Split the Difference. In Part 2, Chris Voss has shared powerful strategies to master negotiation and unlock real influence. With these skills, you're now ready to approach every interaction with confidence and purpose. Remember, every negotiation is an opportunity to create positive change. Go out there and make it happen. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. If you like this book, please share and subscribe to this channel for getting more exciting audiobooks on this channel. Disclaimer. Please note that this channel is dedicated to sharing audiobooks for educational and entertainment purposes only. Full credit for the content and intellectual property rights of these audiobooks is given to the respective authors and their publishing houses. This channel does not claim any ownership over the material presented and is committed to respecting the rights of the authors and publishers. Our goal is to promote literature and reading by providing these audiobooks as a resource for those who might not otherwise have access to them. We encourage our listeners to support the authors and publishers by purchasing the original works.